UK government is rigged to fail, and no one is held accountable. Today we're reviewing a book that lifts the curtain on the broken system of British politics.
Because behind all the noise, debates, and theatrics of Westminster lies a simple truth. The system wasn't built to work effectively.
So join us as we uncover the hidden flaws that drive British political dysfunction in Ian Dunt's How Westminster Works and Why It Doesn't.
Now, before we dive into the details, here are a few takeaways and benefits you'll get from today's episode. These are the big insights that will stick with you by the end.
Firstly, you'll understand the root causes of British political dysfunction. So you'll begin to understand why British governance consistently produces short-term wins at the expense of long-term progress. And more importantly, how this dysfunction impacts everyday life, from housing policies to public services.
Secondly, we'll explore how poorly scrutinised laws pass through Parliament in a rush, leaving key legislation flawed and ineffective. You'll see how this affects everything from public safety to education.
Thirdly, you will discover the hidden power of whips. We'll get a behind-the-scenes look at how the Whip's office controls MPs through rewards and punishments, ensuring party loyalty, and how that leaves little room for independent judgment, even when major decisions are at stake.
Now, those are just some of the big takeaways. We'll dive into many more as we go deeper into the book and the system that drives British politics.
So, if you're new to the channel, welcome. Our goal here at Wise Words is to take complex books and break them down into actionable insights that you can use right away. If you learned something valuable today, please like the video and subscribe. It really helps us continue bringing these deep dives to you.
And if you think more people need to know how the political system is really working, share this video with someone who might find it interesting. Whether you had, a conversation with someone recently about the whole political system, I know I have, make sure to send them this podcast and hopefully they'll enjoy it.
Cool. So before we dive into the specifics, let's take a moment to look at the big picture. How Westminster Works and Why It Doesn't is structured around 10 insightful chapters, each uncovering a different part of the British political system and why it so often fails to function properly.
From the hidden processes of how MPs are selected, to the chaotic ways laws are passed, to the true power behind the Treasury, each chapter explores how the system works, or more often, how it doesn't.
So let's get into the chapter by chapter breakdown. So starting with chapter 1, the vote. This chapter takes us behind the scenes, showing how the most important decision in British politics aren't made during the general election, but much earlier, when local party members decide who will even get the chance to run.
Chapter 2 moves on to the members of Parliament, revealing how party loyalty stifles independent judgment and how MPs are often more concerned with following the party line than representing their constituents.
Then, in chapter 3, the power, we get a close look at the role of the Prime Minister, who on the surface seems all powerful, but in reality is constrained by a weak centre and an overloaded schedule that makes long-term strategy almost impossible.
By chapter 4, the ministers, we see how constant reshuffles and political appointments, based more on loyalty than expertise, create a system where ministers rarely have enough time to understand their department before they're moved again.
Then there's chapter 5, the Treasury, the most powerful department in the UK government, controlling not just the money, but also the fate of other departments. This chapter explains how the Treasury's unchecked power impacts everything from policy to governance.
Chapter 6 focuses on the civil service. So once considered the backbone of British governance, it's now plagued by a lack of expertise and over-reliance on expensive consultants. We'll explore how this has led to the erosion of institutional knowledge and weakened government effectiveness.
In chapter 7, the press, we will dive into how the media, once seen as the watchdog of democracy, has become a victim of financial pressures and the tyranny of online metrics, focusing more on scandal than holding the government accountable.
Chapter 8 takes us on to the Commons, the heart of Parliament, where the noise and spectacle often overshadows the lack of real power MPs have to challenge the government.
In chapter 9, the law, we uncover how the legislative process in the UK is rushed, fragmented, and lacking in meaningful scrutiny. This chapter explores how bills are pushed through with little examination, leading to poorly thought out laws.
And finally, Chapter 10, the Lords. Often seen as a relic of the past, the House of Lords is surprisingly one of the few functioning parts of the system where expertise and deliberation still hold value, but only within tight limits.
So there you have it, a roadmap of the book's key chapters. Each one exposes a different layer of the British political system and explains why it struggles to function effectively.
As we go through each chapter, you'll learn how the systems that are supposed to keep the government running smoothly are actually the ones making it fail. But don't worry, we'll also touch on some potential solutions in the epilogue.
So now that you know how the book is structured, let's jump straight into the first story, a story that perfectly illustrates the kind of dysfunction at the heart of Westminster.
Yes, so in 2013, a minister named Chris Grayling made a bold decision. He decided to privatise the probation service, one of the most crucial aspects of the criminal justice system, without any prior expertise in criminal justice.
It was a move designed to grab headlines and make a mark, but it wasn't even tested. No pilots, no trial runs, just full steam ahead.
And the results? Chaos. See, Grayling's reforms fragmented the probation system, split it between public and private sectors, and led to a sharp decline in quality of service. Reoffending rates didn't drop, and the system failed to meet its goals.
And yet, no one was held accountable. Grayling wasn't punished, in fact, he was even promoted. This failure isn't just a one-off, it's a symptom of a larger problem in British politics.
Why are such ill thought out decisions made? And how does a system allow ministers with no expertise at all to overhaul an entire industry?
Well, this story sets the stage for what's to come as we explore the mechanisms that drive dysfunction in Westminster. Chapter 1, The Vote, the hidden power of selection. So when most people think about British democracy, they picture election day, the general election where everybody casts their votes. But here's the thing, the most important decisions are made long before that day ever arrives. This crucial moment happens behind closed doors in a room filled with local party members. This process is called selection and is where the candidates for Parliament are chosen. Now, why does this matter? Because selection determines who will eventually stand as an MP, and in many cases, who might become a senior government figure, maybe even the Prime Minister. Despite its massive importance, the process of selection rarely gets talked about publicly, and yet it's the first step that shapes the entire makeup of Parliament.
It's fascinating, right? I mean, we all focus on the election, but the real power lies in the hands of a small group of party members who make this decision, often behind the scenes as well. And these decisions have a huge impact on who runs the country, sometimes for decades. I mean, think about that. Like, these local party members are essentially picking future ministers and senior figures and lawmakers. Pretty nuts.
It is pretty nuts, isn't it? So now let's break down how the selection process works. There are 3 key stages. The first stage is initial screening. This is done by party headquarters, HQ, where potential candidates are vetted. The criteria for this vetting? Not really clear to the public. HQ has a lot of control here, and candidates who don't fit the party's image can be weeded out right away. Then we move on to the second stage, local party interviews. Candidates are interviewed by local committees, and if you're with the Conservative Party, this might mean a grilling by the local association's executive committee. At this point, the number of candidates is cut down, sometimes dramatically. And then finally, we reach the third stage, hustings. The remaining candidates present themselves to a local party members in a kind of mini debate. After that, a vote is held, and the winner becomes the party's candidate for that area.
And remember, this is all happening before the general election. So by the time the public is casting votes, the real choice of who they can vote for has already kind of been made. The local party members have decided which candidates will be standing, and in some areas, especially in safe seats, this candidate is almost guaranteed to win the election. So the people deciding the future of British politics aren't the general public, it's these party members behind closed doors.
So the question then becomes, who makes these decisions? So now let's talk about who these local party members are. Typically, they're older, middle class, and deeply invested in the party's ideals. This means that the candidates they choose often reflect their own beliefs, which can lead to a parliament that's not necessarily representative of the general population. In safe seats, where one party is almost certain to win, the selected candidate might stay in Parliament for decades. That's right, a candidate chosen in this private process could become a long standing MP with significant influence, all based on decisions made by a relatively small group of people.
Yeah. So, what are exactly these local party members looking for in a candidate? Well, there are three main qualities that matter. One, the ability to campaign effectively. Can this candidate win the election? Two, the appearance of future minister. Does this person look like they could hold a government position? And three, strong local ties, especially important in safe seats, where being one of the locals can solidify support. But here's where the problem comes in. These qualities are all about winning elections, not about governing well. So the selection process is designed to pick candidates who can win, not necessarily those with the expertise or experience needed to lead effectively once they're in office, which is just crazy because we're just filling all of like the House of Commons with all these MPs that are essentially geared towards being able to win an election. And some of them don't even really need to win because they're going to win automatically. Like they said, with all these safe seats, you just need to be able to maintain a good, performance. But none of it is about being able to, and we'll talk about this later, but be able to challenge legislation or be able to like
Be
critically
able to
analyze.
implement policies or anything like that,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. You don't have to be a good manager. You literally just have to be able to like be pointed in the right direction, say the right things, come across off as like appealing, which
Yeah.
is just you can understand why it's just so
Basically, there's
crazy.
two ways to describe it. You've got to look the part and toe the line.
Yeah, it's just literally that is it. Yeah, you've got
Yeah.
to be somewhat compliant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's also a power struggle going on here between the party HQ and the local party committees. The party leadership at HQ often tries to influence this process because they want strong candidates placed in constituencies they care about. After all, only MPs can hold ministerial positions, so they need loyal people who can rise up through the ranks. But the local members might have a different agenda. They're often more focused on local issues, and might pick someone with strong ties to the area, even if that person isn't necessarily the party leader's first choice. This tug of war shapes the future of British politics. Who gets selected, and where this can have a massive impact on the party's power and direction.
All right, so now let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture, the UK's first past the post system. Once a candidate is selected and goes on to run in the general election, only one thing matters: winning. In this system, the candidate with the most votes in each constituency wins the seat, and everyone else's votes are essentially wasted. And here's a staggering fact. In the 2019 general election, 70.8% of the votes cast didn't affect the final result. That's because in the first past the post system, God, that's like a tongue twister, that votes that don't go to the winning candidate don't count towards anything. So if you live in a safe seat, your vote may not make a difference, and the selected candidate is almost guaranteed to win, which is just crazy. There's just so many votes that just aren't really having an impact whatsoever. And I was so amazed when reading this, just how kind of ineffective our system is and how biased it is,
Yeah. I mean, there are alternative systems, and I think we do touch on it later. But
Yeah.
this is obviously the one that we've got and the one we continue to use.
Yeah.
So yeah, what does this mean for British politics? The first past the post system creates several major problems. Number one, reduced accountability. MPs in safe seats don't feel much pressure to perform because their re-election is almost guaranteed. Number two, increased tribalism. Safe seats are often dominated by a single party, which can deepen political divisions. Number three, corrupted policy making. Resources and policies are often directed toward areas that can swing elections, rather than places that need it most. These problems aren't just theoretical, they affect how the entire country is governed, shaping everything from public spending to legislative priorities. And that's a really crazy part, isn't it?
I
Like,
know.
the idea that if you're trying to convince a certain area of the country, you obviously put loads of resources into them where
Yeah. Yeah.
the places that need it the most sort of get ignored based on this incentive scheme. It's nuts.
What a flawed system, you know?
Mm.
God, I feel sorry for the way that like people who actually live in places that kind of just get overlooked because it's not worth it. It's not worth
Yeah,
it's
because
just an
they're already
investment.
like,
It's a business. It's like at the end of the day, like each party is kind of a business and they're just investing in certain things because they want a certain outcome. They want to win, essentially.
yeah.
It's not about what's right or what's beneficial to like, the standard system. But yeah, then to sum up, the most crucial decisions in British democracy are made during the selection process, before the public even gets to vote. Local party members choose candidates based on their ability to win, not necessarily their ability to govern effectively. And once they're in, especially in safe seats, MPs face little accountability to their constituents.
But the story doesn't end there. Once these MPs are in Parliament, they have to operate within a system that demands loyalty to the party. So, how does that work? And why do so many MPs seem more focused on following the party line than representing the people who voted for them? That's what we'll explore next.
Yeah, so moving on to chapter 2, the members of Parliament, the Westminster system crushing independent judgment.
So, once a candidate becomes an MP, you'd think their main job would be to represent their constituents and scrutinise government policy. But in reality, things don't quite work out that way. The Westminster system is actually designed to stifle independent judgment. MPs are expected to toe the party line rather than act on their own discretion or the interests of the people who voted for them. The driving force behind the system of control, you ask? The Whip's office. This is the party's disciplinary arm and it's designed to make sure MPs stay loyal to the party's agenda. The Whips use a mix of rewards, punishments, and sometimes even threats to keep MPs in check. So instead of speaking up for their constituents or challenging poor decisions, MPs often have little choice but to follow orders from the party leaders.
Yeah. I tell you what, I'd be really interested to know is more about the history of how these things came about. He touches on it now and then, but it's more about like just how it works rather than how it came about. Because it's like a car. You look at the different parts, and the parts have come about over time because, oh, this helps this or that helps that. But the difference is that a car needs to function. Whereas this, it's more of a social system and therefore can get out of hand. But I'd love to know why the whip came into practice,
Well, I guess we can ask then, what problem does it solve? And it's getting everybody to swim in the same direction. So
Yeah.
I guess maybe with a large amount of people all with different interests, it's just a way of forcing quick decisions, I guess, or make it. I mean, it's just forcing people to do what people say, but it's not.
I mean, the function it's
Yeah.
difficult though, because it's like, I don't agree with the concept of lobbying in America. I generally don't understand why that's a thing, because it's essentially just buying off certain people to basically push through a bill.
Yeah.
Which just seems like terrible for politics. Is this just another one of those things where the whip is just like a terrible, concept for politics, because it's just making people vote not in an independent way, but a way that just backs up a party so that things can get pushed through? And maybe that makes things more effective and maybe more efficient in some regards, but it also means that the whip can basically just be bought and then tells everyone else to get in line,
Yeah, for sure. Like, I guess, once again, the reason why it exists is obviously to try and push things through, but at the same time, it's come at what cost, right?
Yeah.
And it's been proven now to sort of, as we're going to later, as we go through the other layers, like it's not necessarily a necessary part of Parliament, but it's become the standard, right? And it's almost like expected now, which is kind of the weird thing.
Yeah, exactly. So then, on that point, let's touch on the role of the whips, enforcing party loyalty. So, the whip works in 3 ways: as instruction, a person, and a process. Every week, MPs receive a document known as the whip, which outlines the parliamentary business for the next 2 weeks, and more importantly, how MPs are expected to vote. It's essentially a set of marching orders from party leadership, and behind the scenes, the whips themselves, senior figures appointed by the Prime Minister, are tasked with ensuring that MPs follow these instructions. You see, right there, it just makes no sense, right? As in, someone is telling you how to vote on a particular bill or legislation, and then also the second part, that they are kind of voted in by the Prime Minister, one person, rather than there being a kind of democratic vote, because you'll just get a Prime Minister who chooses someone who's always kind of going to back up the the prime minister. Not you kind of want someone once again who just toes the line, who just accepts your orders rather than actually questions it. And that's basically what it's a kind of a hierarchical structure, because the whip then does that to everyone else. They want to pick people who will toe the line and who are compliant.
It's interesting as well, just by the terminology of the whip. Either they're really into BDSM or they just love the,
whips and chains. There you go. Yeah.
No, but you know what I mean? Like the symbolism of the whip is like you've got a horse and you're whipping it. Right? You're making it so like, obviously I get that's why they've chosen the name, but it's very in your face and obvious. They could have called it something else, like the cuddler or something, like somebody cuddles you into like shape. Or, do you know what I mean? Something nice, not just like I'm whipping somebody into shape, you know?
Exactly. It emphasizes that you're leading by fear rather than by, loyalty.
No, exactly that. Like it leaves little to the imagination.
Yeah, it's weird. Yeah, it's not it's interesting. All right, so this isn't just a friendly reminder. The whips are there to enforce party discipline. They've got a whole range of tools at their disposal. Rewards like promotions or coveted committee seats, and punishments like career sabotage, public humiliation, or even threats to leak damaging personal information. Now, that doesn't sound like a job you want to be in, does it? It's just like, you don't agree with someone, so they're like, well, I know that your wife's having an affair, or like, just...
Do you reckon that's what happened to Nick Hancock?
Matt Hancock.
Oh, that's it. Yes, Matt. No, you're right. Sorry, Matt Hancock.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. But I think that's probably...
It's probably slightly different, but still like it's...
Yeah, it's just crazy. You're just like knowingly going into something where you're probably going to be blackmailed.
But we'll get onto it later. Like, this is the thing. Nobody knows these things, right? Like, we know because we've read this book now. And obviously, we're assuming everything he's saying is well-researched and all this. I feel like there's part of me that kind of wants to believe this because it's so dysfunctional and everything.
Yeah.
I'm sure it does. I'm sure it is like 90% correct. But I think it's interesting just to think that, because he talks about it. I don't know if we've got it in our notes, but how the young people kind of come in with these ideals of we're going to change Parliament, we're going to change the world, and then slowly they realise as soon as they get into their first meeting, right, you're getting whipped.
Yeah,
it's like fantastic. You got no choice.
Yeah, it's crazy because I think also, although it's not official corruption, just as lobbying isn't corruption, if you do toe the line because there are these incentives, whether they're punishments or rewards, you end up becoming complicit in that system. So you end up becoming a product of that system because you have complied. And I think that's what's like kind of terrible, because it's like, well, you always have a choice, and
it would be very interesting to hear a MP's rebuttal to this book.
Yes, but once again, he kind of touches on it in the book that like there's not that much research or there's not that much research on how MPs behave in a particular way, because it's not, if they get found that they've been talking about it, it's kind of, they're gonna get whipped,
They're gonna get whipped. They love it.
Work it out.
They love it. So we're moving on to then the tactics of control, and it's not whipping. Fear and rewards. So now you might be wondering, how far do these tactics go? Historically, the image of the whip as a bully or a blackmailer isn't far from the truth, which is pretty scary to think about. MPs who dare to defy party leadership risk severe consequences. They might find themselves shut out of future promotions, sidelined within the party, or even publicly embarrassed. But it's not all stick and no carrot. MPs who stay in line and remain loyal are often rewarded with better opportunities within the party. That could mean moving up the political ranks or being given a more prominent role in shaping policy. So for many MPs, it's not just about avoiding punishment. It's about playing the game to advance their careers.
And this kind of control isn't just about individual MPs. It reinforces the power dynamics of the entire party, ensuring that loyalty to the party leadership comes about above all else. Whether it's a new MP trying to make a name for themselves or a veteran looking to secure a cabinet position, the message is clear: fall in line or face the consequences.
I think it's also worth noting at this point, I don't think this stuff is explicit in Parliament. No. It's not like, do this or you're fucked. It's kind of like implicitly done through actions, right? It's not like people, maybe they do make outright threats, but I feel like it's definitely more subtle than that. There's not like there's all a big ruse going on and they're all in on it. Yeah. I think they all know subconsciously that if they go against the decision, it's not going to be good for them.
Yeah.
It's a bit like when you're in the room with your boss and somebody's telling you what to do and you kind of just think, oh, I'm not going to do that. You're going to get
Yeah.
fired, right? It's kind of understood to be like that.
I think it's also the fact, like, I completely agree. And I think it's also leading, not leading, following following the others around you. It's like that. There's a great kind of, not story, but I guess analogy of three monkeys put into like a cage, and
Yep.
there's a step ladder, and at the top of the step ladder there's some bananas, and every time a monkey goes up, they all get, like, squirted with water, okay, like cold water. So then they keep trying, but then they kind of learn through punishment not to do it. And each stage they basically take out a monkey and put a new monkey in, okay. And so the new monkey will try and go up, and then the others like beat him up, okay, to not do it, because otherwise they all get basically sprayed with water. But basically this iteration keeps happening until all the original monkeys are no longer there, and they're just other monkeys, but they still follow that same behavior, even though they don't know why not to go up that up the step ladder anymore. They just didn't do it because they would get beaten up by the other monkeys. And now it's basically this kind of ingrained behavior, even though they don't know the reason for it. And I feel like that can happen a lot in this kind of system, where there are punishments if people actually go against it, but no one does it. And if no one does it, no one's going to actually do it. They don't want to be that person that like sticks their head up out of the sand.
For sure. And there might be snitches.
And what do snitches get?
Stitches.
There we go. Exactly.
In fact, funny enough, this leads straight into the next point about the intelligence networks of the whips. So
exactly.
Here's another interesting aspect of the whip's office. They don't just enforce discipline, they also act as an intelligence gathering network. Whips maintain close relationships with MPs, always gauging their moods and feelings. They report back to party leadership about potential risks, like MPs who are unhappy with party policies or might rebel during a crucial vote. This gives party leaders a chance to manage internal dissent before it becomes a public issue. The whip's office, in effect, keeps the party leadership informed about any cracks in the party's unity and helps control how these cracks are managed. It's all about keeping everything under the surface while presenting a unified front to the public. And this kind of makes sense when you see that, like, media leaks or people who might be quitting and stuff. I guess that's when the whips kind of failed and it's managed to leak out to the public.
Yeah, and I reckon there is like a witch hunt that goes on once something that he didn't want happen comes out, and then he's just like trying to find, using all of his little spies to basically find the culprit. God, yeah, bless that person. All right, another thing to consider is that MPs aren't exactly set up for success when they enter Parliament. Most new MPs arrive without much, if any, training on parliamentary procedure or legislative scrutiny, as we were talking about before. You'd think there would be a formal process to teach them the ropes, right? But in fact, this lack of training is deliberate. By keeping MPs in the dark about the complexities of parliamentary procedures, the party ensures that they remain dependent on the guidance of the whips and party leadership. This keeps MPs from becoming too independent or too knowledgeable, because that would be such a terrible crime, reinforcing the idea that they need to follow the party line instead of questioning decisions or taking action on their own. And it's just, it's crazy, because like I understand the point that like you don't want someone questioning every single decision, right? Because then that becomes an ineffective system. You want some kind of optimal amount, but at the same time, you kind of do want that in politics, I find, because the decisions that they make impact millions of people's lives. It's not like, it's just at Tesco's and someone's questioning, oh, does it matter if I put this on the shelf here or the shelf here? The consequences aren't that large. But here they are. And yet the whole system is basically geared towards not having anyone question anything or be too knowledgeable about something, because it will go against the whip. Yeah, fucking
it's nuts, isn't it? This then very nicely leads on to the overwhelming workload. So the constituency casework trap. So on top of all this, MPs are often drowning in constituency casework. Over the years, the expectations of MPs has shifted, with more and more of their time being taken up by local issues, responding to individual cases, and dealing with their day-to-day problems of their constituents. While that might sound like a good thing, MPs helping their local communities, it actually creates a huge problem. By spending so much time on local casework, MPs have less time and energy to scrutinise legislation or hold the government to account. This leads to a vicious cycle. Poor legislation results in ineffective government programmes, which in turn generate more problems for MPs to deal with at the local level. So the more they focus on solving local issues, the less they can focus on the big picture.
Yeah. And of course, some MPs do manage to stand up to the party leadership. These are the backbench rebellions, when MPs vote against their party orders. But these rebellions are rare and they come at a high cost. MPs who rebel publicly often face social and professional consequences within the party, making it difficult for them to advance their careers or hold influence. But when rebellions do happen, they can be powerful. A well-timed rebellion can force the government to compromise or back down on certain policies. These acts of defiance are one of a few ways MPs can truly hold the government to account, but they're a last resort, and not something MPs can do without risking a lot personally.
Yes. So here is the root of the problem. The selection process we talked about in the last chapter prioritises loyalty to the party over independent judgment or expertise. MPs are chosen for their ability to follow the party line and win elections, not for their ability to think critically or bring fresh ideas to the table. So once they're in Parliament, MPs are expected to do exactly what they were chosen for: follow orders, keep quiet, and toe the line. The entire system is built to reinforce this obedience, with the whips and party leadership holding the reins tightly. And it's hard to see how that isn't the case with the setup. It really is hard to see, like with the fact that the whip even exists in the first place, whether it's implicit or explicit or whatever.
Yeah.
The fact that there is no formal training, the fact that the selection process is choosing people, it's really hard to see how the system hasn't been created for anything other than what it currently is trying to get, which is like everybody towing the same direction as the people who are up top.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's crazy. And I think, you can extrapolate this same kind of approach, but to the rest of the country. We don't get taught how the political system works in this country. We don't get taught it at school. We don't understand the actual structure or layout.
We get taught democracy, and that's what we have.
We get told.
Great.
Yeah, exactly. That's the ironic
That's anything you get
thing.
told. Yeah,
We're told about the concept, and then we're just told that our country does it, but we don't actually go into details about how it tries to achieve that, which it clearly fucking doesn't. Because by keeping your citizens uneducated on a particular topic, then they can't challenge anything, can they? They can't scrutinize it. They can't question, which is exactly what they're doing with these MPs here.
You're right. I was going to say they can't. They can't if we don't have the education and awareness of how things work, we can't criticize the stuff.
Yeah.
We can't criticize the process itself, and therefore we end up going for red herrings. And that might even just be like immigration, for example. Fine, it's a problem,
Exactly.
but it's become apparently the only problem, rather than the actual political system itself.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you said, it's a red herring, 100%. We are essentially getting whipped right now by the government. We are being told to vote on certain things, and a lot of that will come probably through media, like you're saying, with voting on immigration or certain things like that. But it is interesting, and on this topic, I wonder whether we have been fed, or whether we just naturally have this kind of idealistic perspective of how the government should be run. We think that it should be a perfect system, but that's probably unachievable.
Agreed.
And yet we hold it and compare it to these kind of expectations. But where we get these expectations from is probably, I would assume that British politics is one of the oldest modern democracies in the world. We were kind of the first to it. We were first at Magna Carta in 1261 or whenever it was. So you would think that because it's embedded in tradition, that it's got this kind of positive association to it, and that we must be upholding these kind of standards. But this book just goes to show you how we've let the system become, chaotic and toxic.
Well, I think it just, as we'll get onto later, but it just kind of brings up the sharp contrast of sticking to things just because it's always been done that way.
And that's the thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's part of our culture that we disguise everything. We disguise the lack of innovation as tradition. I am a traditionalist. Yeah. I like traditions, but if it actually impacts effectiveness, then I don't see the point. Especially with something, once again, where it's a system where the consequences of it are affecting millions of people.
I like that a lot, actually. It's a good idea. Like we lack innovation, so we dress it up with tradition. Yeah, it's all good because we need to keep it the same way because it's the way we've always done it.
Yeah,
everybody knows that's like the enemy of the progress, right?
it's a prime example
Especially
of that whenever I like see political stuff is House of Commons with all the jeering and stuff, and that the people have to kind of vote in person, like out loud. It's just like, this doesn't make sense. Like, it doesn't. We all know about like how people will basically vote if someone who's got slightly or more authority around them, well, they'll just toe the line. It's like, surely there could be a better system to this, and yet we're just doing it because it's traditional. And it's like,
yeah,
fuck, like none of that makes sense. But so to sum up, once an MP is elected, the Westminster system ensures that they're kept in check by party leadership, with little room for independent thought. The Whip's office controls everything from voting behaviour to career advancement, and MPs are often overwhelmed with local casework, leaving little time to challenge government policy.
But if MPs don't have real power, who does? How does decision making work at the highest level? In the next chapter, we'll explore the power and take a closer look at the Prime Minister's role, where power seems absolute, but reality tells a different story.
So join us as we peel back the layers and reveal why the Prime Minister often struggles to wield their power effectively. In Chapter 3, The Power.
So, the Prime Minister's sobering reality. You'd think being Prime Minister means having ultimate power, right? Well, think again. The moment a new Prime Minister steps into number 10, the reality hits hard and fast. Sure, they just won the biggest job in the country, but what's waiting for them inside? A pile of problems and a quick reminder that the power they have is far more limited than it seems. On day one, they're hit with sobering responsibilities, like drafting a letter of last resort for nuclear submarine commanders in case of a national catastrophe, and facing immediate briefings on terror threats. Oh, and don't forget, they're told they can no longer use their personal phone. The message is clear. Welcome to the weight of power. Now get ready to carry it.
But here's the twist. Despite what we're led to believe, the Prime Minister is often constrained by the very system they're supposed to lead. Their ability to shape policy and govern is undermined by a combination of limited resources, conflicting agendas in government departments, and constant crisis. So, is the Prime Minister truly the most powerful person in the UK? Or are they trapped in a role where their authority is more symbolic than real?
This brings us to what's known as the theory of the weak centre. The Prime Minister may be the head of government, but they can't run everything on their own. The reality is that they're often overwhelmed by the sheer size and complexity of government departments. These departments, staffed by experts and civil servants, all have their own agendas and a lot of day-to-day work. So even though the Prime Minister has the appearance of power, they can feel isolated. They can't single-handedly prepare legislation or consult on every policy. For that, they rely on departments to handle the details, which means they're constantly trying to steer a massive, unwieldy machine.
I mean, think about it. Even major decisions have to go through multiple layers of bureaucracy, and those departments often have more resources and influence than the Prime Minister's office itself. It's like trying to pilot a massive ship with a tiny rudder. The Prime Minister can set the direction, but the departments are what move the ship, and they're not always heading in the same direction. All right, so moving on to the immense power on paper, but dysfunction in practice. Now, here's where things get interesting. Despite all these constraints, the British Prime Minister has immense power compared to leaders in many other democracies. They can create or abolish ministries, hire and fire cabinet members at will, and make decisions without the checks and balances you'd see in countries like the US or Germany. Just as we were saying before, that they can, choose the whip, whoever they like it to be, which obviously has some kind of top-down effect of passing bills through and everything like that. So the issue isn't a lack of power, it's that the system itself is dysfunctional. The Prime Minister has the tools to make sweeping changes, but in practice, they often can't use them effectively because the government is so bogged down in its own bureaucracy and crises.
So, the dysfunction of number 10, a house steeped in tradition. So let's talk about the physical heart of government, number 10 Downing Street. For all the tradition and history tied to it, the building itself is part of the problem. It was originally built as a private residence not the nerve centre of a modern government. The place is cramped, chaotic, and reactionary. Instead of being a well-oiled machine for running the country, is more like a relic from a bygone era. Prime ministers often spend their days rushing from meeting to meeting, briefings, cabinet sessions, security conferences, constantly reacting to the latest crisis. This leaves little room for them to think strategically or focus on long-term goals.
And the layout of number 10 reflects that. There's no dedicated space for large teams or strategic planning. It's a building that's better suited for a history museum than a hub of modern government. Sure, there's plenty of tradition, but that tradition can also be a massive burden, as we were literally talking about before. The grand staircase lined with portraits of former prime ministers is a constant reminder of the past, but it also symbolizes how weighed down the office is by history. And inside the number 10, there's another interesting power dynamic at play. Proximity equals influence. So the closer you physically are to the prime minister, the more power you hold. Advisors and civil servants compete to get face time with the prime minister because that determines their influence on decision making. This creates an environment where political machismo, is that how you say it?
Machismo.
Yeah. Machismo takes over. It's less about what's irrational or necessary, and more about who can get in the prime minister's ear. And because of this constant competition for attention, important decisions can be overshadowed by the need to jockey for power.
That's right. It's not necessarily about expertise or even the best ideas. It's about being in the right room at the right time. This culture of who's closest to the boss drives much of the day-to-day workings of government, and it's why we often see decisions being made that prioritise short-term wins over long-term strategy. Now, how does the Prime Minister communicate with the rest of the government? There are 4 key bodies they rely on: the Cabinet, the Cabinet Office, the Private Office, and the Policy Unit. The Cabinet is supposed to be the heart of decision-making, but in recent years it's become more ceremonial. Real power tends to reside in smaller, specialised subcommittees where detailed policy decisions are made. The Cabinet Office supports this process, helping to coordinate work across government, while the Private Office acts as a filter for what information reaches the Prime Minister. The Policy Unit, on the other hand, brings together expert advice to guide decisions. This unit has also become a training ground for future political leaders. Many of its members, known as Special Advisors or SPADs, often go on to hold major roles in government.
And these structures exist to help the Prime Minister manage the massive responsibilities of office, but they only work if they're all well coordinated. And that's often not the case. As we've seen, the dysfunction within number 10 and across departments can make it hard for the Prime Minister to actually use these bodies effectively. But there is one notable success story that stands out in this sea of dysfunction: the delivery unit. Now, this was created under Tony Blair's administration, and the delivery unit was designed to focus on measurable outcomes for government policy. Led by Michael Barber, it tackled long-term objectives like reducing A&E waiting times or by consulting itself from the daily political chaos. Now, what made the delivery unit successful was its commitment to evidence-based decision-making and focusing on specific goals. I mean, who would have thought, you know? It wasn't about reacting to crises, it was about delivering real results. Unfortunately, after Blair's time in the office, the delivery unit didn't survive, and subsequent prime ministers have struggled to replicate its success.
And that's the core issue we're seeing. Prime ministers might have the power to shape the future, but the system they're working in makes it almost impossible to achieve long-term success. From the physical limitations of number 10 to the constant pressures of crisis management, the Prime Minister is often stuck, reacting to events instead of proactively leading.
But here is the thing. See, while the Prime Minister might feel trapped, they're still the most powerful figure in British politics. So what happens when they wield that power to appoint ministers? In the next chapter, we'll explore the ministers, where the Prime Minister's power to hire the fire shakes up the entire government. Oh, I like that. I want to say it again. Where the Prime Minister's power to hire and fire shakes up the entire government. Oh,
God, it's so good you said it twice.
I know.
So join us as we dive into the world of cabinet reshuffles, political manoeuvring, and the impact of short-term appointments on the country's long-term future. So, Chapter 4, the ministers. If there's one real power the Prime Minister wields, it's the ability to hire and fire ministers at will. In fact, this is one of the biggest weapons in the Prime Minister's political arsenal. No checks, no balances, just a reshuffle when it's time to keep people in line or shake things up. But here's the catch. While cabinet reshuffles can assert control, they can also throw government into disarray. Ministers often aren't in their roles long enough to truly understand the complexities of their own departments, leading to instability and short term thinking. So, what looks like control can actually cause more chaos.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy that the prime minister can do that and so often whenever he wants. And you kind of saw this throughout COVID and throughout Brexit. It's just the amount of cabinet ministers that were basically like, oh, they're brought in and then off they go. And he'll talk about it a lot more. But just the fact that ministers don't stay in a position for more than, was it 3 years? I think the longest was like 2 years and 9 months. But essentially what that means is that unless you're aware of how you think, you're going to be choosing people that are just yes people. There's confirmation bias. You just want people to basically confirm what you want to get put through. There's no checks and orders in place.
And if you don't, you fire them.
Exactly. That's the thing. It's like, it doesn't make any sense, or it should at least be harder to do something. Because I know that there can be people that really just, maybe they dislike you, and so they try and make it as difficult as possible. But still, it's seen that it's so easy. And yeah, so on this point, the constant reshuffling of ministers has a real impact on governance. So the average tenure of a minister in many departments is less than 2 years. So less than 2 years, not even 3 years. But what does that mean? Well, it means ministers don't have enough time to develop expertise or see through long-term projects. They're in and out before any meaningful changes can take root. So let's break down why this matters and how the Prime Minister's power to hire and fire can both help and hinder the effectiveness of government.
So, as we briefly discussed before, short-term political appointments over expertise. So, first up, let's talk about the real issue with these short-term appointments. Unlike in industries like finance or healthcare, where appointments are based on expertise, ministerial positions are more about political loyalty. The Prime Minister often appoints ministers based on their ability to campaign, network, and stay loyal to the party, not because they're experts in the areas they're tasked with managing. So you might see a former health minister suddenly appointed to run the defence department, even though they have no experience in that field. The result? Well, ministers who are in over their heads struggle to get up to speed before they're inevitably shuffled out.
I fucking hate this thing about the government. Like, this is something that it makes me embarrassed to my core that our country or the different areas of our country are led by people who have no fucking clue what they're doing. Like, the health minister will be some fat, overweight person who's probably going to die of a heart attack at like 65. How can they be put in charge of this? It grinds my fucking gears.
We now know the answer, right? Political loyalty. It's crazy, isn't it? It's like if anybody remembers back in the introduction when we were talking about Chris Grayling, my understanding was he failed with the probation system, so he was the head of, I can't remember what that department was, but he basically screwed up the whole probation system in the UK, and then he was made, I think, the head of the Department of Transport, I think, or something like that. It's like, so he was so shit at one job, and he literally screwed up the whole probation system. And then you promote him to the head of logistics and like delivery in the country. It's like, what? He's got a track record of not making good decisions, and you've just given him more power. Exactly. And arguably something that matters. Actually, probation is pretty serious as well. But I was going to say, like, transport, for God's sake, like it's screwed up in this country.
Yeah, millions of people's lives. Like, it's insane. And who's giving them those promotions? Who's moving them from here to there? Who's keeping them in the fucking cabinet? And this comes back to, like, the Prime Minister basically being able to just pick and choose where people go. And it's fucking insane. Like, it's just, how is a system like this supposed to work? I mean, and I the thing that like really almost made me like, reading some of this book made me depressed. I was just like, how is this going to change? Because, for instance, a minister being in a position for so short of a period, and they know that they're not going to be there for very long, so they need to do something, right? They need to do something also that looks jazzy, that looks good for their reputation. Like, they're the person who wanted to change the police, or they're the person who wants to change the NHS. So they put something in, they fuck it up, and then someone else comes in and changes it. And the issue is that, like, nothing, even the thing that really got me was, like, even if it was the best policy, okay, even if the person put in the best policy, it's still going to get changed in like 2 years
Yeah.
because some other minister's going to come in and be like, well, I've got to do something now. It doesn't matter
Yeah.
whether it lasts or not, or whether
It's
it's actually beneficial. I just need to do something because my reputation as a politician, as a minister, needs to show that I'm doing something. And
yeah.
that was just like, so even when the system could be going right, it's the way that the system is designed
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
then going to change and get worse again. It's just,
It's the Nassim Taleb from Anti-Fragile idea of intervention bias. We're so biased towards intervening in things that might not even necessarily
yeah,
need intervening. It just needs time to play out the repercussions of maybe a systemic change, right?
yeah,
We're so quick. It's like, I think the example he uses in Anti-Fragile is like, being very quick to give people medicine rather than realizing that, maybe their headache might just pass in 3 days.
yeah,
But we still
yeah,
give them
exactly.
paracetamol. It's like we have to be seen to be doing things to prove our worth. Like the government has to be seen to be doing things. You know, it's funny because a lot of things where like, especially in entrepreneurship and business, most of like the great things come from like one amazing decision which is just followed out for like 10 years without
Yeah,
changing it.
yeah, yeah,
Because if you constantly just were like, okay, it's not working as effectively as we wanted, let's just change direction. It's like,
yeah.
it's pointless. You just undo everything. You undo everything that's been done before, and you start learning how to figure out this problem again.
Yeah,
And the fact that you've got a new person who never had an expertise in it come in and then just be like, right, I'm running the whole logistics in this country right now. And
yeah,
I think it's the classic case though of like, what's the word, where people are intelligent enough to think they're like, they don't realize how ignorant they are in certain things. Like they've gone to Oxbridge, they
yeah.
think they're smart, so they think they're smart at everything, and therefore no matter what they do, they can just decide the best for everybody else. And they get put in a position where their ignorance gets put in front of their face. They go ego blind, this, that, and they just bulldoze on through
Yeah.
because they think they're smart because they went to Oxford or whatever.
These
And
MPs that, like, for instance, person doing, in charge of the NHS or someone who is in charge of the transport, they probably don't even use the NHS, or they probably don't
no,
even, travel on the fucking tube. So, it's not like they're very representative.
no,
But yeah,
100%.
it's nuts. Like there was a quote that he had in there from like one minister or some kind of MP, and they were just like, sometimes I wish that a minister would get in and they do nothing for 4 years, and then another minister would come in and they do nothing for 4 years, purely just so that you can see how these kind of policies are transpiring over time and whether they actually are beneficial or not, rather than being changed every like 2 years. Fuck.
Yeah.
Oh, all right, rant over, but I can't promise that won't be the only rant in this. Um, yeah, so it's not just about a lack of expertise, because ministers know they won't be in the role for long. They often focus on short-term wins that will boost their reputation within the party, rather than implementing long-term strategies that take time to bear fruit. The Prime Minister's reshuffling power turns governance into a game of survival where ministers are more concerned with staying in favour than truly understanding and fixing the issues in their departments.
Yeah. And there's another structural problem here. The pool of available ministers is small. In the UK, the Prime Minister can only choose ministers from the members of Parliament or the House of Lords. Unlike in other countries, they can't bring in outside experts or technocrats to run departments. This means the Prime Minister is often forced to choose from a group of politicians who may not have the skills or knowledge necessary to lead massive government departments. And because many of these MPs were selected for their campaigning abilities,
Yeah,
as we
exactly.
discussed in chapter one, rather than their management skills, the system creates a real bottleneck in terms of finding capable leadership.
You're picking from a terrible pool of people,
Well,
really. Like,
exactly. You're like, if the whole point is to keep people in line, right? You're not picking leaders. You're picking like people who follow stuff, like follow the trodden path, right?
yeah. Well, this is
Yeah.
once again, it's like, you know, all the MPs, part of the criteria has been that, they're compliant and that they'll toe the line. And then the PM is choosing from those people the people that are probably the most compliant of the lot, or the people who are most compliant to them. It's just like, it makes absolutely no sense. And that's where the whole dysfunction kicks in. The Prime Minister has to juggle political considerations, keeping key figures happy and ensuring party unity, while also trying to find competent people to lead these departments. Whether they succeed in that or not, I don't know. But with such a limited pool, those two goals often don't align. What you end up with is a lot of political operators in roles they aren't prepared for.
Yeah, that it just makes sense from what you see around the country.
Yeah, really. God.
So now let's touch on the private offices and civil service relationships. So once appointed, ministers don't manage their departments on their own. They're heavily reliant on their private office, a small group of senior civil servants who act as their closest advisors. The head of the department, known as the permanent secretary, oversees the broader management of the department and offers strategic guidance. But here's where things get tricky. Ministers and civil servants often clash. Ministers want to push forward with their political agendas, while civil servants who prioritize long-term stability might resist sudden changes. This friction can slow down decision-making and make it difficult for ministers to implement their policies.
And that kind of makes sense because, like, just because the minister is moving every fucking 5 minutes doesn't mean that everyone else in the department is also moving. So you're going to have this discrepancy of people who are still working in that department, okay, who want to see things through, want some longevity to some of the, like, you know, laws or legislation that's going to be pushed through. Whereas the fucking minister, you know, he's not gonna be there for very long. Basically, just wants to do something for his career. Yeah, but let us not forget that civil servants are usually much more experienced than ministers. They've served under multiple governments and have deep understanding of how things work. Ministers, on the other hand, are often thrown into new departments with little time to get up to speed. If they can't develop a good working relationship with their private office, they're in for a tough time. For some ministers, this friction can make or break their ability to lead effectively. And I just imagine being someone who works in that department and then suddenly you've got this new boss who knows fuck all about your department. Like, that would be so
And then
annoying.
tells you what to do.
Yeah, and then tells you what to do. Like,
Or
you
tells
would
you
have
what the problem is.
yeah.
Tells you like everything you thought about this is wrong. You know.
And especially if they have that kind of personality that you were mentioning before, where, you know, so far they've just been told everything they do is right because they've gone to Eton and whatnot, and now suddenly they're just there being cocky and arrogant, and they know fuck all about. Yeah, made that wind me up the wall. Already is.
In fact, this is a really good point because now we're going to get onto the role of special advisors or SPADs. So now let's talk about the role of special advisors. Originally, SPADs were brought in to give ministers expert advice, offering a perspective that civil servants might lack. But over time, the role of SPADs has changed. Today, they're more like political operatives, there to make sure ministers stay on message and follow the party line. SPADs are often drawn from informal networks within the party. They're rarely appointed through a transparent or meritocratic process, and their primary loyalty is to the minister who hires them, not the public or the civil service.
Now, this creates an interesting dynamic because while SPUDs are supposed to offer valuable advice, they often act as a buffer between ministers and civil servants, filtering out ideas that don't align with the party's agenda. This can lead to ministers relying more on political advice than on expert opinions. And with SPADs usually being more focused on media management than policy expertise, this can result in decisions that prioritize party politics over what's best for the country.
So one thing I kind of want to add here, I do in general quite like the idea of SPADs.
I think it makes
they
sense.
allow
The concept
for expertise to be brought into the government where it is lacking, as we've just discovered through the minister process. I guess it's always the case of everything. When it's misused, it's bad. When it's used properly, it's fucking good. Like, it's a good idea. Implementation might be different because, like he's arguing here, if you bring in somebody who is just towing the party line, then their function is different to actually bringing in outside information. People like, for example, Dominic Cummings. I know he's very controversial, but I've seen a few things with him on Chris Williamson and stuff. He is somebody who I would have thought, actually, having watched that now, maybe I'm wrong, but my opinion of him now is he was actually a good SPAD. He was somebody who was willing to fight against or to raise his opinion against, like, Boris Johnson, for example, and that's obviously why he got fired in the end.
Yeah.
But these people can be used in good ways to actually try and drive things forward. So for me, it's almost like a mechanism that was brought in to try and combat the fact that these people aren't experts. But once again, if the people who are the ministers choose the SPADs, which they do, they then ultimately can pick somebody who's gonna back them up in an argument rather than challenge them and focus on the what's best for the country, which is basically what you need then is just a minister with the right temperament and the right ideas. Exactly. But as we've seen, because they've been selected to be towing the line, it is very hard to probably find those. Yeah,
Yeah,
And
exactly.
then if they do start not towing the line, the prime minister can just fire them. So
Exactly.
it's
Yeah.
fantastic,
It's just it's so
beautiful.
flawed. Oh, funny.
So the overwhelming workload of ministers. One of the reasons ministers struggle to be effective is the sheer volume of work they're expected to handle. They make dozens of decisions every day, many of which could be delegated but are escalated due to the civil service's risk-averse culture. So the infamous red box, filled with documents requiring ministerial approval, is a constant symbol of this workload. Ministers are often signing off on decisions they don't fully understand or even have time to scrutinise, leading to cautious, vague decision making. This lack of clarity undermines their authority and makes it harder for them to make meaningful changes.
Yeah, and because they're so overwhelmed, ministers can't dive deep into the complex issues their departments face. Instead, they fall back on political jargon, pardon me, and avoid taking clear positions. This creates a culture of indecision and inertia, where real progress is slow and ministers feel disconnected from their work. Over time, this leads to frustration, not just for ministers, but the public who expect results. And I've always found this with, like, because I remember reading, what was it, Why We Get the Wrong Politicians by, is it Susan Baker? I probably got that wrong. But she was touching on this point as well. She was just basically describing an MP's life, and it's pretty shit. Like, you're constantly having to go to London all the time. So it's works if you're like, represent a constituency that's close to London. But, you have to be going up there once a week for a certain amount of time. And then you've got a lot of constituency work to work on. And then most of the time you've got this fucking red box of like 50 letters a night that you have to look at. And I think one of the MPs was talking about how realistically you don't open that box until you've finished work, and that could be like after dinner. So you've had this whole long day of, like, your whole day is just diarized. You've just got so many meetings after meetings, even if you don't need to be there. So once again, that's inefficient. But then you also have these 50 letters of decisions to make. And I think, as they talk about, but like, a lot of civil servants don't want to make decisions in their department because then the responsibility falls on them. So they basically just send it up the chain to be like approved or not. So then this, the minister has to look through all these decisions, and it's just
Yeah.
like, fuck, like, you must be so sleep deprived for the whole
Yeah.
time that you work as an MP.
Decisions are hard to make as well, right? Like,
Yeah.
even I struggle with the most mundane of decisions every day, like, choosing what to bloody wear or what to eat for fucking lunch. And then these people are making decisions that, impact people's lives. And I've always found that the quality of my decision making definitely decreases as the day goes on, right? As you get more tired.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of making decisions when I'm tired and, maybe not giving my full attention to an issue,
Yeah.
the fact that if I was making a decision of their caliber or their level, I wouldn't feel comfortable making more than two
Oh,
or three
crazy.
decisions, like important decisions a day. But these people are being forced with it. God, I couldn't even imagine.
I mean, there's so much literature on how your decision making is impacted by so many factors, stress being one of them, sleep
yeah,
deprivation, like pressure, all these kinds of things. And you'd think that because we know all of that now, you should design a system that kind of alleviates that, especially once again for someone who the decisions that they're making are so impactful. And have such large consequences. And yet, it's just almost like those people are just, constantly in a state of like inertia. But
so frequent turnover and short-term thinking. To make matters even worse, the constant reshuffling of ministers creates instability. Between 1979 and 2010, the UK had 13 Home Secretaries, 13 Education Secretaries, and 14 Pension Ministers, each staying in their role for an average of just over 2 years. More recently, positions like Housing Minister have changed hands almost every year. This rapid turnover means there's no continuity in leadership. Ministers barely have time to understand the issues before they're moved on, leaving their successors to start from scratch. So long term projects get abandoned or reversed, and then the cycle continues.
yep, and with ministers focused on making a quick impact before they're reshuffled again, the system prioritizes short-term wins over sustainable long-term solutions. The constant churn of ministers undermines the effectiveness of government, leaving departments in a perpetual state of instability.
So, while the Prime Minister's power to hire and fire ministers might seem like a strong tool for control, it actually fuels instability and short term thinking. Ministers are more focused on surviving reshuffles and staying in favour with the Prime Minister than they are long term governance.
But if ministers are struggling to manage their departments, who's really in control of the country's finances? Well, in the next chapter, we'll explore the Treasury, the most powerful department in the UK government, and how its influence can shape or even block government policies.
So stay tuned as we dive into the heart of government spending and find out why the Treasury holds so much power over every other department. So, Chapter 5, the Treasury. The Treasury is the real power behind the government. So when it comes to government power, you might think the Prime Minister holds the reins. But what if I told you the most powerful department in the UK isn't number 10, but the Treasury? In fact, the Treasury controls more than just the country's finances. It monitors and influences the work of every other department, shaping the very policies that affect our daily lives. On paper, the Prime Minister may seem like the head of government, but in reality, it's the Treasury that often calls the shots. It acts as the ultimate gatekeeper, deciding what policies get funded and, by extension, which ones are even possible.
Yep, and that's exactly why the Treasury is known as the first among equals in the UK's government departments. Not only does it control the purse strings, but it also has the power to veto ministerial initiatives. So no matter how great an idea sounds or how important it is for the country, if the Treasury says it's too expensive or doesn't fit the budget, it's not happening.
So, let's break down how the Treasury maintains this grip. It's rather simple. The department that controls the money controls everything else. This power dynamic has deep roots in British history, dating back to when the Parliament gained control over taxation, securing its independence from the monarchy, which is also a very interesting tidbit. Fast forward to today, and that financial control means the Treasury plays a central role in shaping government policy. No major decision can move forward without the Treasury's approval. Departments submit their budget requests, and the Treasury decides what gets the green light and what doesn't. This makes it nearly impossible for any department to operate independently from the Treasury's oversight.
And it's not just about saying yes or no to funding. The Treasury also scrutinises every proposal with a cost-benefit analysis, ensuring that policies align with its financial priorities. This creates a dynamic where other departments have to play by the Treasury's rules, whether they like it or not. And if policy doesn't meet those strict financial criteria, well, it's dead in the water.
I mean, that just makes me laugh a little bit. Like, cost-benefit analysis of what people's health. How can you do that?
Yeah.
Like, do you know what I mean? There's certain things that you can't. Like, the government's meant to be there to provide, maybe even at a loss, certain things. But the whole point is we're subsidising these things for the collective good.
Yeah.
But no, it has to pass a cost-benefit analysis to get funded. It's like, what?
It kind of touches on a lot of things that we've talked about where it's very reductionist. We're reducing everything down to numbers. And what's funny is we've just been talking about how ministers will push through legislation or bills or whatnot because, there's a short turnaround and they want to do something while they're in a certain department. Well, who do you think approves those plans? It's the Treasury. So as we'll talk about in a minute, we'll just talk about how, despite there's a cost benefit analysis, it's like, I don't know what they're fucking analyzing because they're approving so much bullshit.
Yeah, true. So let's talk about the two people who make the Treasury such a powerhouse. The Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Chief Secretary to the Treasury. These two aren't just managing budgets, they're shaping the future of the entire country. The Chancellor is often considered the second most powerful politician in the UK, right behind the Prime Minister. And in fact, the Chancellor's power is so significant that they're often seen as a potential successor to the Prime Minister. And that's not all. The Treasury also has a unique leadership structure, with both the Chancellor and the Chief Secretary holding significant influence, making it more powerful than any other department, which typically has just one senior minister.
Interesting that the Chancellor of the Exchequer basically becomes the next Prime Minister. Or, because that's what we saw with Rishi Sunak. And I think Liz Truss worked at the Treasury as well, but it was just interesting. I didn't think about that until then. So even the Treasury's junior ministers, like the financial and economic secretaries, hold substantial influence over government decisions. Their roles often serve as stepping stones to higher political office. The sheer amount of control the Treasury has over the entire government makes these positions some of the most sought after in British politics. If you're in the Treasury, you're right at the centre of the power.
It's interesting, isn't it? So, the role of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the IFS. But this Treasury's influence doesn't stop with government. It also extends to the wider financial world, particularly through its relationship with the Institute for Fiscal Studies, or IFS. The IFS is an independent research institute that often challenges Treasury decisions, offering critiques that make headlines and shape public opinion. You might think this would be a thorn in the Treasury's side, but here's the twist. The Treasury actually relies on the IFS to help control its own ministers. By funding part of the IFS through government channels, the Treasury can point to its independent findings as external validation when ministers push for more spending or risky policies.
How does that make any sense? They're funding part of the IFS, and the IFS is supposed to be some third-party kind of objective, you know, organization that comes in to advise.
It all
but also
depends how you
challenge.
define the word independence, right? Oh wow, none of us leaders are on the board. You know,
Yeah, that's it.
but
That's
we fund
exactly
it.
it.
Yeah,
I
it's the same.
guarantee you. Yeah, it's just typical fucking politics 101. Yes, in other words, the IFS plays a dual role. On the surface, it appears to hold the Treasury accountable, but in reality, the Treasury uses the IFS's findings to reinforce its own position. So, so when a minister demands more funding for a project, the Treasury can point to IFS report and say, "See, the numbers don't add up." It's a clever way of maintaining control while appearing open to outside scrutiny.
So I can kind of understand why the IFS, or why the Treasury uses the IFS to, I guess, do its research to back up its points. My understanding, I guess, is the fact that the Treasury probably doesn't have its own in-house department, maybe for finding those statistics and studies. So therefore, outsources that to the IFS. Because technically, in my head as well, you want the Treasury basing its decisions on valid, good financial data,
Yeah,
which
absolutely.
is supposedly independent from it. Which I guess it's independent in the sense that there's maybe nobody in the Treasury in the IFS, but there obviously is funding, so there's a connection through money. But isn't there a connection through money for for fucking most things, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But I'd rather them base their criteria for decisions based on valid data from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, for example, right? Like for me, I can understand why it's the setup. I think it's interesting that he talks a lot about, finding or using it to back up its points, but then it has to have some data to back up its points anyway. I guess
No, I
Find It
guess
happens to be the one they fund,
yeah.
but then it allows them to have oversight on what they should be monitoring, which allows them maybe to do their job better. Then
Yeah, no, I agree.
if it was completely independent, it might be measuring the wrong things, for example.
Yes, I guess we shouldn't see it as like an adjudicator and more as just like a research department.
Exactly.
Because if it wasn't a separate entity and it was just like another department within the Treasury, then no one would question it. So I guess that's kind of it to some extent. Because
I
yes,
just wanted
absolutely,
to
you
play a
need
slightly
it to.
different, side of the argument, because one of the things I realized after reading this book is it is a very aggressive attack, I guess, on the current system. And I think it obviously is valid, and the concerns are valid here too. But I think sometimes it can make it out to be even worse than it is, and forget sometimes why these things are put, or why these things are the way they are, because they're usually there to solve a specific problem. Like I'd prefer them to have some data to make their decisions rather than none.
100%. Yeah. No, of course you definitely want there to be research to like back up certain things. It's just whether if the only research that is being done is just to back up rather than to like look.
I agree. You want it
objectively.
to be balanced, sort of thing, but I guess it's almost impossible to ever achieve. But
This is true.
anyway, at the heart of the Treasury's power is its corporate culture. Treasury officials see themselves as the ultimate guardians of the nation's finance. Their role is to defend the taxpayer against what they view as the fiscal irresponsibility of the other departments. This defender mentality drives everything they do. The Treasury sets budgets, evaluates every new proposal, and insists on rigorous financial oversight. In many ways, this approach has helped keep government spending in check, but it also means that ambitious projects often get blocked before they can even begin. And I would obviously argue that's probably something to do with the cost benefit analysis, when, I guess the benefits might be ethereal, unmeasurable. It might be risky, for example.
I just don't know how that applies though. When, like, for instance, what's the train that they started?
I just do, yeah.
the HS2, which was so ridiculously expensive that no one wanted, and then they basically did away with it halfway through building it. But it's just like, how did they fucking condone that?
I think it's the classic case though of sunk cost bias, isn't it? They're like,
Yeah.
they've already ploughed 7 billion in it, and it's obviously a political disaster to be like, which they obviously had to do in the end anyway.
Yeah.
But to be like, yeah, no, we just ploughed loads of money in this, and it's not going to work.
They should have just listened to a bit of Rory Sutherland,
Yeah.
all about, what was it? Kind of,
well, getting strippers on trains rather than
yeah,
increasing
exactly.
the fee.
Let's enjoy the experience from
Let's
getting up north to London.
exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's look for psychological solutions, not physical ones.
Yes. Yes, and so this is a rigid approach. This rigid approach can sometimes stifle innovation. Departments are often reluctant to propose bold, long-term projects because they know the Treasury will likely shoot them down. And the focus on short-term cost-benefit analyses means the Treasury prioritizes areas that are already productive, like London, over regions that could benefit from increased investment. It's a system designed to protect, not necessarily to grow. And I reckon that also ties in with what we were talking about at the very beginning, whereby certain areas are prioritized with resources over others because they're an investment into keeping that seat, to having a stable seat in that party. So I wouldn't be surprised.
I would also, yeah, on that note, I think obviously with London, it's very clear that there'll probably be a return on investment because obviously there's a lot of people, a lot of industry, etc., etc. So for them, it's, I guess, a safer bet than, investing somewhere up north where they're like, oh, well, there won't be any return there. So fuck it, So how do other departments deal with the Treasury's iron grip? Well, they've got 3 main strategies. First, they can play the teacher's pet. So submit modest, detailed proposals that align with the Treasury's strict criteria. This way, they avoid conflict and secure approval quickly. The second strategy is more direct, appealing to number 10. If a department can't reach an agreement with the Treasury, they might ask the Prime Minister to step in. But this approach carries risks. It can create tensions between the Prime Minister's office and the Treasury.
Yep, and the final strategy is the riskiest, going public. So departments like health or defense, which can easily rally public sympathy, might use the media to push for their proposals, creating public pressure on the Treasury. But this move can backfire. If the public doesn't buy into the narrative or if it leads to internal conflict, the department could end up in a worse position.
I mean,
in many ways... sorry, go on.
I was going to say, like, probably advocating for strippers on trains that actually get into the public's eye.
Yeah. I think everyone would back that up there, In many ways, the Treasury sees itself as the last line of defense against the short-termism of ministers who are more focused on winning the next election than on long-term stability. The Treasury officials argue that their strict oversight is necessary to ensure the sustainability of government finances. And they believe that ministers often avoid politically risky decisions, like raising taxes, leaving the Treasury to act as the bad cop when it comes to keeping the country financially stable. This constant tension between the short-term political gain and long-term financial health is at the core of the Treasury's role in the government. And that's quite an interesting perspective. Like, when it makes sense that a lot of politicians won't do, like a lot of politicians don't do things that they think the public won't like. And it's not until it's almost necessity, and that's when the Treasury's role comes through. It's like, when you see, or is it the Chancellor of the Exchequer come through with the budget, and it's almost like, even if we don't like it, we kind of have to accept it. But it's almost like then the Treasury doesn't get as bad of a backlash as if a politician was to do it, because it's almost like we accept that, we know that there are certain expectations from the Treasury.
I also guess there might be a level of the fact that the Treasury is an abstract entity. I mean, obviously there are faces like the Exchequer, etc.
Right.
But if you kind of blame the Treasury, you're blaming like a system, and you can probably levy more public anger towards that than a particular minister who might, get stabbed or attacked effectively, because there's like a scapegoat,
Absolutely.
So we're moving on to the Treasury's secrecy and the power of the budget. So one of the Treasury's most powerful tools is its annual budget. But here's the thing. The process is shrouded in secrecy. Officially, this secrecy is to prevent market-sensitive information from leaking. but there's another reason. The secrecy also gives the Chancellor political power, allowing them to control the narrative and showcase government priorities. The budget isn't just about managing the nation's finances, it's a political event. And the Chancellor often pulls a rabbit out of the hat at the end of the budget, unveiling a surprise policy to distract from the overall state of the tax system. This theatrical approach has become a tradition, but it also hides the deep flaws in the UK's tax system.
And those flaws are hard to ignore because the UK's tax system is unbelievably chaotic, riddled with inconsistencies. For example, the VAT rates are applied unevenly, and council tax is still based on property values from 1991. Income tax creates strange distortions where people earning different amounts can end up paying wildly different rates. It's a system that desperately needs reform, but it's kept afloat by the Treasury's tight control.
So, while the Prime Minister may lead the country, the Treasury is the real power behind the throne. Its control over finance shapes everything from departmental budgets to government policy, but this power comes at a cost. Sometimes the Treasury's caution prevents real progress from being made.
Yeah, but if the Treasury holds all this power, who's really making sure the system stays balanced? In the next chapter, we'll dive into the civil service, the engine behind government operations, and find out how this centuries-old institution helps or hinders governance in the UK.
So let's pull back the curtain on the civil service in chapter 6. Behind every minister and prime minister is a massive, often invisible force keeping things running, called the civil service. It's supposed to be the engine that powers British government, the neutral body that ensures the country keeps moving no matter who's in charge. But is this engine still working smoothly, or is it spluttering under the weight of its own dysfunction? Here's the truth. The civil service has long been idealised as a steady hand on the wheel, ensuring stability in times of political chaos. But the reality? It mirrors the same problems we've seen in Westminster: a lack of expertise, internal friction, and broken processes. So is the civil service helping or hindering the UK's political system?
I mean, it's a critical question, Jess, because, the civil service plays such a huge role in shaping how policies are implemented. I mean, they're the ones who make sure that the government ideas become real-world actions. But over the years, the civil service has become bogged down in its own set of problems: misaligned incentives, a preference for generalism over expertise, and an unwillingness to challenge ministers when necessary. So let us break all this down and see just how much this vital institution is both holding the government together and pulling it apart.
The myth of the perfect civil service.
Mm.
So, for decades, there's been this comforting myth that the civil service is a model of impartiality, efficiency, and quiet competence. We like to think that behind the scenes, civil servants are making sure that no matter how chaotic politics gets, the country stays on track. But that is a comforting fantasy. The truth is, the civil service is as vulnerable to the dysfunction as any other part of government. Over time, it's developed the same issues we've seen in Westminster, favouring loyalty over skill, decisions driven by short-term thinking, and a reluctance to make tough calls. The reality is a far cry from the image we've all bought into.
And a big part of that decline started during the era of Thatcherism. Margaret Thatcher saw the civil service as an obstacle to her reforms, and she didn't have the patience for cautious advice. Over time, she reshaped the civil service to be more compliant, cutting through its independence and making it more of a tool for ministers rather than a separate body of expertise. But it didn't stop there. By the time Tony Blair took office, the civil service's role had been transformed even further. No longer was it the principal's advisor to ministers. Its job had become to deliver whatever the ministers wanted, regardless of whether the civil servants agreed or not.
So, one of the civil service's biggest weaknesses today is its obsession with generalism. Instead of building deep expertise in specific areas, civil servants are expected to hop from the department to department every couple of years, gaining broad but shallow experience. In a system that's already struggling, this creates even more instability. Imagine trying to solve a complex issue like housing, health, or defence, but you've only been in your role for a year or two. Well, that's what most civil servants are up against. They don't have the time or the deep knowledge to truly fix the problems they're tasked with addressing.
And it's not just about time. I mean, there is an internal culture that actively discourages specialization. Being an expert in one area is often seen as a failure, as if sticking around in one department too long means you're not ambitious. Instead, civil servants are rewarded for moving up and out, constantly switching roles, but without specialists who really understand the ins and outs of key issues, the government is left making decisions with only surface level knowledge. Think about it. When 4 out of every 10 senior officials in 6 major government departments have been in their roles for less than a year, it's no wonder that the real progress is hard to achieve. It's crazy to create an incentive whereby people have to get up and go and can't actually try and do a good job. And I remember him like quoting someone who was a civil servant, and they were like, "Look, I've been, I can't remember how long, a bunch of years on like working, I think on like transport." And he's like, "I really like my job, but I know that I'm sacrificing like career progression because I enjoy it. So I'm sacrificing getting a better pay, getting, all this kind of stuff purely because I'm doing a better job somewhere else." Like it makes absolutely no sense, but
Yeah,
neither
it
does a
is
lot of
all
this.
very, very messed up.
Yeah.
And that churn, civil servants constantly moving from post to post, was made even worse by two major events: austerity and Brexit. Austerity measures led to recruitment freezes and pay cuts, which not only discouraged long term retention, but also left the civil service understaffed at a time when it needed more people, not fewer. Then came Brexit, and with it, a massive demand for senior civil servants to staff in new departments like the Department for Exiting the European Union. This led to even more rapid turnover, with civil servants moving between posts faster than ever before.
And that turnover has had a serious cost. The civil service has lost much of its institutional memory, those long standing experienced workers who remember how things used to be done, and can offer valuable historical insight. Without that continuity, departments have been struggling to keep up with the complexities of Brexit, austerity, and everything else thrown at them in recent years. Yeah, I just wanted to touch on this point because I remember in the book he was talking about how civil servants kind of progress, and there's basically like a grading system. So I think you start at grade 13 and you move up. And grade 7 is something like considered to be like a pretty good level. You're making a decent like income, but that's what people would strive for. And then obviously, there's fewer people towards the top. But they were saying that, it could, or 30 years ago, it could have taken you about 20 years to reach grade 7. And then when Brexit came in and they were talking about how there was a surplus of civil servants needed because there were new departments opening up, basically all these people were just shot to the front of the queue. And so whereas grade 7 used to be a proxy for how good this person is, how competent they are, how much they actually know, how much experience they've had, because you used to be able to say, oh, this person's been here 20 years, he might know not a lot. Now you have a lot of people who are suddenly at the top who don't know anything. And they were talking about how some people would go into like meetings and the person in charge was like someone who just come out of uni like 2 years before, and now they're in this position where clearly don't know that much. But it's just a bit ridiculous to, when you change up the whole system of how someone progresses through something and then you change it halfway and it just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, especially when those positions are the positions of authority,
Yeah.
which yeah, it's
Silly,
not.
silly, silly.
Another major problem is the civil service's growing reliance on outside consultants. Because the civil service has lost so much of its internal expertise, it's also had to turn to the private sector and its consultants to handle tasks that used to be done in-house. And that comes at a steep price. Consultants are expensive, often charging thousands of pounds a day, and they don't come with the long-term commitment needed to build real change. What's worse, many of these consultants are the same people who started their careers in the civil service, then moved to the private sector to be trained as specialists. So we're essentially paying top dollar to hire back the expertise that the civil service used to have for free.
Yeah. And every time the civil service relies on these consultants, it loses another chance to develop its own internal skills. Instead of nurturing long term expertise within the government, we're hollowing out the system, leaving it increasingly dependent on outside help. This reliance on consultants also means the civil service is less equipped to challenge ministers or provide truly independent advice because they don't have the depth of knowledge to back up their positions. It's a vicious cycle, losing expertise, making it harder to build future expertise. And that weakens the whole system.
Yeah. It's crazy that that's the situation you find.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is.
I mean, in a business sense, that'd be horrible. It's like your competitor stealing all your best employees after you've trained them. It's like, and then selling them back to you to consult.
It's just fucking expensive as well.
Of course.
Like, they were talking about how some of these things just go on for years, like, you know, and some of these like research or whatnot. And so you have these consultants coming in that tend to be like quite professional, like quite large, you know, professional companies that cost a lot because, ironically, the government wants to pretend like they're outsourcing, like they're doing a great job, and so they hire these like top companies, which obviously come with a higher cost. So these things will just go on for years, and they were talking about how some of these, you know, consultants made like, what was it, like $1.5 million in a year. And it's just ridiculous that they're spending so much money on that rather than investing in people long term.
Well, it's really smart from the consultants, isn't it? It's like, okay,
Yeah.
which market has got, you know, the most amount of money, which is technically unlimited with the government because you can just print more. Who's in the biggest demand? Oh, the government. Who's the easiest to sell? Probably the government as well. Because for the government, what they care about, I guess, is using consultants that are in the top firms. I mean, Rory Sutherland, I think, puts it pretty well when he's like, you know, you don't get fired from using one of the big four consultant companies to advise you, because that's what everybody would do, and you use it almost as like a deflection mechanism, like, oh, you can't blame me. We paid for the KPMG and they gave us this advice, you know. So it's almost like deflecting the blame down to them, and then you know what, paying top dollar basically to probably decide the thing you've already wanted to decide, get them to give you a spreadsheet telling you it's a good idea, then going and doing it anyway.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Terrible.
So on that note, let's talk about the culture within the civil service. So over time, civil servants have learned that the safest path to career advancement is to say yes to whatever the minister wants. Rather than challenging policies they believe won't work, civil servants have become increasingly compliant, going along with ministers to avoid career roadblocks. This has created a generation of civil servants who focus more on pleasing their superiors than on delivering independent expert advice. And when you have a culture where no one's willing to push back, bad ideas can go unchecked, leading to policy failures that affect the entire country.
It's not that civil servants don't care about doing a good job. It's just that the system rewards conformity over independence. And if the civil service is to regain its role as the true advisor to the government, it needs to rebuild their culture of expertise and challenge. Without that, we'll continue to see policy failures that could have been avoided with better scrutiny.
Yeah, so let's wrap it up then. So while the civil service is meant to be the backbone of the British government, it's been weakened by years of short-term thinking, constant churn, and a growing reliance on external consultants. What we have now is a civil service that's struggling to keep up with the demands placed on it, leaving ministers without the expert advice they need to make informed decisions.
But if the civil service is failing to hold ministers accountable, who is left to do the job? Well, in the next chapter, we'll dive into the world of the press, the supposed watchdog of democracy, and see whether they are truly keeping politicians in check or if they're just adding to the dysfunction.
So, Chapter 7, The Press. When we think of the press, we often imagine it as the last line of defence. Journalists uncovering scandals, holding politicians accountable, and shining a light on the inner workings of government. But here's the question. Is the press really doing its job, or is it just adding to the chaos? Because when it comes to political journalism in the UK, it's a mix of both. Yes, the press can be powerful, but it's also deeply flawed. It often fails to scrutinise policies properly, focusing instead on drama, gossip, and sensationalism. So what happens when the watchdog gets distracted by the spectacle?
Well, it's not just about what they report, Jess. I mean, it's kind of how they operate. I mean, the press is a complicated relationship with politics, often influencing the very systems they're supposed to be keeping in check. I mean, but while they're great at digging up scandals, and they're not so great at digging into the details of how government policies are actually impacting everyday lives. And I guess part of that is also it takes longer to transpire. It takes longer to see how this kind of, bill has manifested and impacted so many lives. Whereas, if you've got something right in front of you, then you can kind of tell them, okay, well, look, this is a scandal that either happened or it didn't.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I say it's a lot easier to report. As we know, statistics and numbers are very hard on the brain to comprehend. So, explaining complex policies and their repercussions to people is less interesting than seeing Matt Hancock fiddling with his secretary or whatever it was in his room. Like, one of them's very
Oh
visceral
gosh.
and real,
Yeah.
and one of them's just like, you can't really. One of them you can't get out of your head. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. So
Um,
funny. Yeah. So on that note, let's pull back the curtain on the press and see where they're helping and where they're hurting the system.
Cool. So let's go into the journalism strengths, exposing the drama. The one thing that we can't deny is that the press excels at uncovering political drama. Scandals involving corporate lobbying affairs. Sorry, Mark. Scandals involving corporate lobbying, affairs, or even those notorious lockdown parties make headlines because journalists are relentless in chasing the story. This type of reporting holds politicians to account in the public eye and can bring real consequences. But here's the catch: this focus on the drama means that deeper, more important issues often get sidelined. The press is good at exposing sensational stories, but falls short when it comes to scrutinizing actual policies and their long term impacts on people's lives.
And that's where the problem lies. I mean, journalists can spend weeks, even months, digging into a scandal, but they don't have the time or the resources to follow up on how policies are implemented or whether they're working as intended. The day to day business of governments, how decisions are made and how laws are passed, gets lost in the noise of the headline, grabbing stories. This imbalance leaves the public well informed about the scandals, but in the dark about how government functions at a deeper level.
Yes, and then we've got to talk about the financial collapse of journalism. So, why is this all happening? One major reason is the financial collapse of journalism. Historically, newspapers thrived on advertising revenues, but with the rise of the internet, advertisers have shifted their focus online, where they can target audiences more precisely. This has left traditional media outlets scrambling to survive. Without the steady flow of advertising income, newsrooms are shrinking, and journalists are under more pressure than ever to produce content quickly. Investigative journalism, the kind that uncovers deep systemic issues, takes time. And the time is something most journalists don't have anymore.
No, exactly. And I mean, the decline in funding means fewer reporters are available to cover important stories, especially at the local level. Local newspapers used to be the front line for holding regional governments accountable, but many have been shut down or bought out by large conglomerates, leaving a huge gap in coverage. And this lack of local journalism has a ripple effect. Without reporters digging into what's happening on the ground, it's harder for the press to connect national policies with their real world impacts. The results? A press that's more focused on Westminster bubble and less on how the government actions affect communities across the UK. And I guess this relates to my previous point about how, it's more difficult to see how a bill or a law is impacting people's lives because most of that would be, well, normally reported on a local level, right? But now
Yeah,
because you don't have that, you're kind of detached from that. Whereas if you're in Westminster and you're focusing on one politician, well, then you can be like, oh, look, there's one scandal here. It's easier, it's more, attention grabbing, and you don't really see the full consequences of like a bill or a law until a lot of time has passed and many people have already suffered from it.
yeah, true. It's also quite hard to follow the practical effects of certain policies, I guess, without,
Yeah.
like you just said, the long term view, as well as the ability to measure certain outputs of that decision. Like, it obviously depends on what the policy is, but like getting all the statistics available to you to then be reported on,
Mm.
which can also be influenced by policy decisions on definitions. Because I guess if you're setting a policy and you're setting the metrics for it to be measured against, you can redefine certain terms. We
Yeah.
discussed many times before, but like COVID, and what was defined as a COVID death was something along the lines of being put into the hospital for COVID and dying, even though you might have had cancer or something, or something else that could have killed you. You would have just been
Absolutely.
called a death patient that way. So I do wonder whether like who is actually reporting on these policies, who knows the actual step-by-step implementation mechanisms of the policy
Mhm.
apart from the people doing it, and then how can you provide up-to-date relevant data without like a longer term time frame? I don't know. Like that is almost an
Yeah.
impossible task really, which is why it's so hard to it's like, once again, it's much easier to catch Matt Hancock fiddling than it is to discuss how many people have been killed in car crashes or something.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
So yeah, now let's get into the heart of the matter. The press isn't just a passive observer of politics, it's actually an active player. But are they influencing politics in a way that benefits the public, or are they interfering to push their own agendas? The relationship between the press and politicians has always been complicated. Journalists need access to politicians for stories, and politicians need favourable press coverage to stay in power. But when that relationship gets too cozy, it can lead to situations where the press isn't holding politicians accountable. They're working together to shape public opinion.
Yeah. And I mean, we've seen this play out time and again. Think about like Rupert Murdoch and his influence on British politics. I mean, his newspapers like The Sun and The Times have had the power to sway elections and shape public discourse for decades. And it's not just him. I mean, many high profile editors and media moguls have close relationships with politicians, which raises questions about whether the press is, I mean, really independent. This influence goes both ways. I mean, politicians try to curry favor with the press, and the press uses its power to influence political outcomes. It's a delicate balance, and when it tips too far in one direction, I mean, the public loses out.
Yeah, it should be disclosed, this sort of stuff. I feel if there's any
Yeah.
sort of relationships between politicians and press outlets, it should be almost like put on the front cover or something. Like this is,
Yeah.
I am mates with the prime minister. Sorry, conflict of interest here, or
It's
some
just such
formal
a
way of like,
murky area, right? Isn't it?
yeah,
It's just like you're not, because I can understand the point of, for instance, the government needing to. I mean, we read Why Leaders Lie, okay, and not that I'm talking about lying in this case, but like there is a way that a head of state communicates with their people what they're allowed to divulge and what they're not, right? You're not going to suddenly divulge your secret plans for something, right? Because then that might impact the plans. So I can understand the idea of releasing certain information to certain people or you wanting to make something sound in a particular way, but it's like, where is there a line to start with, and where is that line? Like, how do you know what should be or what shouldn't be said, and are you depriving the public of certain information that you might think is bad but actually it needs to be said? It's such like a difficult environment to kind of what's the word, transverse
first.
traverse, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, it's tricky.
Yeah, like you said, it's very grey. So, at the core of political journalism is the lobby system, an exclusive group of journalists who get direct access to briefings from the government. Every day, the Prime Minister's spokesperson holds lobby briefings, giving reporters the latest updates on government activity. But here's the thing, these briefings are notorious for being stonewalled. The spokesperson sticks to scripted lines no matter what questions the journalist asks. It's all about controlling the narrative, and it leaves little room for real scrutiny.
And after the briefings, what happens? Well, the lobby journalists huddle together and discuss what they just heard, often coming to a shared interpretation. This groupthink can lead to a homogenous view of the day's events, where multiple newspapers end up reporting the same story in almost the same way. The lobby system, while designed to give journalists access, often creates an echo chamber where critical analysis is replaced by recycled talking points. And I thought that was a really interesting point, actually, how just like afterwards all these people from different papers just talk about the same stuff, and then they just end up reporting on the same stuff as if like that was the only consensus that could be taken from whatever that person said.
Yeah,
Yeah.
my thought straight away went towards like they do this every day. Like, why don't we just let the government get to work and do stuff and have a catch up every week? But I guess it's because the news outlets need something new every day to talk about the government. I guess when this crisis is even easier because there's something already on the minds. But I just thought it's interesting that they like constantly need like, what are you doing today? What are you doing today? Like if somebody did that to me, I'd be pissed off. Like, just what are you doing today? I'm like, fucking, it's my like none of your business. Let me crack
nothing
on.
has changed since yesterday.
Exactly, exactly. Like, fine, maybe there is certain things that could go past that threshold, but the need to constantly like it almost means you end up becoming a busy idiot because you're busy intervening in all these things because you need to prove you're doing stuff. Like, we're doing this, we're doing that, we're doing that. It's like just do it.
It's noise, not signal, isn't it? It's just that whole Nassim Taleb point. It's like if you tune into it every day, all you're going to see is it just going. But whereas if you tune into it now and then, it's like you can just see the actual pattern emerging.
I still abide by the I don't know if it was Nassim Taleb, but the heuristic of using if something's important enough in the news, somebody else would tell you about it.
Yeah,
like otherwise you don't need to see the news. Like somebody, if it is really important, like World War III starting, somebody will message you being like, "Fucking hell, we're in trouble." You know, you're gonna know. You don't need to watch the news. It's a good filter. So, the decline, of local journalism losing the front line. So we touched on this earlier, but it's important to dive deeper. The decline of local journalism has had a devastating impact on accountability. Local papers used to be the ones holding town councils, police forces, and local governments accountable. They were the connection between national policies and local realities. But with so many local papers shutting down or being absorbed by larger media companies, that crucial connection is being lost. Communities no longer have reporters digging into how national decisions are impacting their schools, hospitals, and services.
And without that local lens, the national press misses out on important stories. What happens in a small town might seem insignificant to the national media, but it can be a microcosm of bigger issues facing the country. Without local journalists reporting on those stories, the press loses its ability to connect the dots between policy and its real-world effects. Exactly what we were talking about earlier. And I could also imagine how the point of how resources go to specific places, basically just to solidify seats, is also overlooked because there isn't a lot of report on it.
Yeah, probably because aggregated statistics, like overall the country's getting better. Oh, but wait, hang on a second, that's because 90% of that increase is London, and everywhere else is like screwed up. Yeah. So this is a really good point as well. The internet and the tyranny of metrics. So one of the biggest changes in journalism has been the rise of the internet and the shift to digital metrics. Instead of relying on long-term readership, news outlets are now driven by page views, likes, and shares. It's become a race to capture attention, and that means stories need to generate clicks. This shift in focus has created what some call the tyranny of metrics, where journalists are judged not by the quality of their reporting, but by how much engagement their stories get online. It's a system that rewards sensationalism over substance.
And when you're focused on getting as many clicks as possible, it's easy to see why the press chases drama. Outrage drives engagement, and engagement drives revenue. But in the process, deeper investigative reporting gets pushed aside. Why spend weeks working on complex stories when a quick headline about the political scandal will get more attention? This focus on short-term engagement over long-term impact has shifted the priorities of many newsrooms, making it harder to produce the kind of journalism that truly holds power to account. And if you want to understand this on a greater scale, then check out our podcast on social warming, where we talk about how politicians using certain social media and basically making something seem more extreme to basically get more of a response, and then how this basically transpires to a dynamic where a lot of politicians are exacerbating a lot of things and exacerbating a lot of their views. It's really interesting.
Yeah. So now moving on to the rise of special advisors and controlled messaging. So another major factor in the changing landscape of political journalism is the rise of special advisors, as we discovered earlier, so the SPADs. These political appointees are tasked with managing media relations, acting as gatekeepers between the ministers and the press. But here's the catch. Unlike civil service press officers, who are focused on explaining policy, SPADs are there to spin stories in a way that benefits the political party. Their job is to control the narrative, not to provide transparent and objective information.
Yeah, and I mean, like, just on that topic, I mean, if you've ever seen like House of Cards or anything like that, you see how the people who basically give these speeches at the end of the day, and their kind of relationship with their superiors and what they're told to say to some extent. But if going off everything we've talked about so far today about how chaotic and toxic these systems are, and how basically everything is in this state of like, uncertainty, and it's all ambiguous and everything's being rushed through, then there isn't much to say. So what you're going to try and put forward is something that is certain, that is confident, that the people can still have confidence in. So it's kind of nuts when you think that that's the discrepancies, and it's absolute chaos behind the scenes, but you're going to be like, well, so this is what we're doing at the moment. Yeah, and kind of touches on what we've been talking about recently with like the communication, as in like doubling down on kind of confidence about how you say something, or using certain types of words that make you sound more confident. We were talking about that in Magic Words last week, actually. The way you say.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I guess in this specific use case of the SPADs, they're talking here about getting in like PR people as the advisors to help spin narratives.
Exactly.
And these guys are professionals
at spinning. Yeah. And so this creates a new dynamic. Journalists who rely on access to SPADs for information are often getting a filtered, polished version of the truth. The more power SPADs have over media relations, the harder it becomes for journalists to break through the spin and get to the heart of the story. And this has led to a more controlled media environment, where political messaging is tightly managed, and the press struggles to provide the kind of accountability that's needed in a functioning democracy.
So let's sum up the chapter. So while the press is supposed to be the watchdog of democracy, it's facing its own set of challenges. Financial struggles, the decline of local journalism, and the rise of digital metrics have made it harder for journalists to hold power to account. And to that, the influence of special advisors and the lobby system, and you have a press that's often more focused on drama than on digging into the deeper issues.
But if the press isn't keeping politicians in check, who is? Well, in the next chapter, we'll dive into the Commons, the heart of the British democracy, and see whether it's truly the place where the people's voices are heard, or if it's just another stage for political theatre.
Chapter 8, The Commons. So, a stage for debate or a hollow shell? The House of Commons is often seen as the beating heart of British democracy. It's where politicians are supposed to debate, challenge each other, and make decisions that shape the future of the country. But behind the spectacle, is the Commons really functioning the way we think it is? Or has it become little more than a stage for political theatre? Because while the shouting and drama might look like a passionate display of democracy, the truth is that the Commons is often powerless to challenge the government. With the government's tight grip on parliamentary time and its ability to push through legislation, is there any real accountability left in the system?
Well, this is a critical point, Jess, because what happens in the House of Commons affects every aspect of British life, from laws to public services, but the way it functions today raises serious questions about its ability to truly hold the government to account. It's loud, it's dramatic, but when it comes to making real change, is it as powerful as we're led to believe? Well, let's peel back the curtain and explore whether the Commons is still the democratic force it's meant to be, or just a hollow shell.
So, one of the first things you notice about the Commons is the noise. It's chaotic. MPs shouting, jeering, and interrupting each other. The atmosphere is intense, and if you've seen Prime Minister's questions, you know exactly what we're talking about. It's like a gladiator's arena, with MPs on each side battling it out across the chamber. But here's the issue. While it makes for great TV, the shouting and interruptions often drown out any real debate. MPs struggle to make their points, and meaningful discussion gets lost in the noise. Instead of a forum for democratic debate, it can feel like a staged performance.
And this performance has real consequences. The theatrics might give the impression of lively debate, but the reality is that most decisions in the Commons are already made before MPs even step into the chamber. I mean, the government's majority means it can push through whatever it wants, and the debates we see are often just for show. So while it might look like the government is being held to account, in reality, the outcome is almost always predetermined. The shouting might be loud, but the substance of the debate, not so much.
Yeah.
It's just, oh mate, it's so sad. Like reading this book, I kind of was just hit with the fact that it's all just a show. That like everything is basically just to make it look and appear like we're doing loads of stuff, but it just seems like nothing, like a decision was made 2 hours ago, and yet we have to go and do this performance for 2 hours to pretend like we're actually doing something. And when he goes in and talks about the Commons chamber and how the government have like all the resources in the world, the opposition basically doesn't challenge anything unless it makes it look like it's good on TV, or that makes
That's
them look
it,
good.
isn't it? It's more like political scoring and from the mass media.
It is.
It's like you just said, it is theatre. It's just showmanship. How can I make my point to like criticize
Yeah.
what they're about to push through, and hopefully get a soundbite on the news?
It's like, apart from, and obviously like this is a simple, like, we don't actually know what it's like to be in those positions, but from reading this book, and I know it's slightly biased, but what I can understand what an MP does in a constituency, but I don't really understand their role when it comes to the to Parliament, because they don't. It's all for show, right? They're told where to vote. They're not really allowed to challenge anything. And so basically, why the fuck are they there unless they're a minister and they actually are putting through some stupid rule to make their, career look good? I just don't. It just seems like it's just to convince the people that we have some kind of grasp on what is actually going on.
I think, yeah, we'll get into the sort of nitty gritty in a second, but I think it's a lot towards how I guess it's evolved over time. I would assume maybe it originally started off as actually debates.
Oh no,
And
I
and
100% believe that.
and over time, basically, what they realised is, shit, we're just debating too much, not getting anything done. So they slowly started encroaching, as we'll see in a minute, started increasing the powers of government to put through legislation with a majority vote. So even if they debate, they win anyway. And that's kind of why, if you always think about it that way, that's kind of almost why the whole system now ended up at the point it's at. Because I
Absolutely.
guess they just faced too much resistance from opposition, too many dissenting opinions. Because obviously, when you get a big group of people, shit doesn't get done because everybody has a different opinion on it. So what they really need is fucking systems to toe people in line, which is basically what they created. So if anything, they've almost over the years accommodated for the fact that they actually did have a real democracy with real arguments and debates, to the point where now it's just a pseudo one, because they've basically fixed the problem of not getting stuff done, not making decisions, or not having critical dissenting opinions within the decision process, to now just being like, yeah, we'll just do it for theatre. And the best bit about it is they've fucking televised it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly.
That is a conscious choice as well, which is more interesting.
But that's the thing, is like, I understand that all these things, all these components to it have probably come about from good intentions. And I understand that, there is a point that is optimal between being effective and, and actually being like true to the kind of nature of making the best decision, right? That's one of the drawbacks of a democracy, is that you can't push things through quickly. And sometimes you do get dictators that actually are able to do a lot of stuff because they have all the power, whereas democracy slows it down because you have to consider everyone's opinion. This, obviously, we don't do that. But then it's funny that we are describing it as a democracy when we're kind of almost in between now, because you can see where all the power is being held, and it's kind of as a result of a stupid system rather than like one individual person. But it's just, it's just so much of it is just for show now, it just seems.
Especially listeners, you will understand this more as we get into the next part, because this explains a lot. So one of the reasons why the Common feels like it's lost its bite is the government's control over parliamentary time. So Standing Order number 14, which dates back to 1982, gives the government precedence over the business discussed in the Commons. What this means is that the government gets to decide what is debated, when it's debated, and for how long. This rule effectively gives the government control over the Commons agenda, leaving little room for MPs to raise issues independently. So even when the debates are held, they often have no legislative impact unless the government allows it. In other words, MPs can talk all they want, but without the government's support, nothing will happen.
And this government control extends to every part of the parliamentary schedule. Even the length of the debates is tightly managed. And while in some other parliaments, an independent business committee sets the agenda, in the UK, it's the government that announces the business every Thursday, dictating what will be discussed the following week.
Cool. So, select committees, a glimmer of hope for scrutiny. But it's not all doom and gloom. There is one part of the Commons that still offers hope for real scrutiny: select committees. These committees are tasked with investigating specific policy areas, and they operate independently of government control. Unlike the noisy debates in the chamber, select committees work quietly, gathering evidence from experts and specialists to produce detailed reports. These committees have the power to call witnesses, including ministers, and grill them on the issues at hand. And because they're made up of MPs from across the political spectrum, they often manage to set aside party loyalties and focus on the facts.
In fact, select committees are one of the few places in Westminster where expertise and cooperation win out over political theatre. They produce some of the most insightful reports on government policy, highlighting failings and recommending changes that can lead to real improvements. But here's the catch. While select committees can shine a light on government shortcomings, their recommendations don't have the force of law. The government is free to ignore their findings, and often that's exactly what happens.
Now let's take a look at the right reforms, empowering the backbenchers. There's another small step toward empowering MPs that came in the wake of the MPs' expenses scandal in 2009. The right reforms were introduced to give backbenchers more influence and improve the transparency of Parliament. One of the key changes was to make select committee chairs elected rather than appointed by party whips. This was a big deal because it meant committee chairs were no longer beholden to the party leadership, giving them more independence to pursue important issues without worrying about political repercussions.
And these reforms also created a backbench business committee, giving ordinary MPs a chance to propose debates on issues they care about. This was a move to break the government's stranglehold on parliamentary time and give MPs more of a say in what's discussed in Commons. But while the reforms have made some improvements, they haven't been enough to tip the balance of power away from the government. The government still holds most of the cards when it comes to setting the agenda and passing laws.
So now let's move on to John Bercow's reforms. One person who tried to shake things up even further was former Speaker of the House, John Bercow. He used his position to revive two important tools for holding the government to account: emergency debates and urgent questions. These tools allowed MPs to force debates on issues the government didn't want to discuss and demand immediate answers from ministers. It was a way to put pressure on the government, especially during moments of crisis.
Bercow's reforms were all about giving Parliament more power to scrutinise the government. Under his leadership, MPs were able to challenge the government on key issues in ways that hadn't been seen in years. He gave Parliament a greater role in debates that the government might have preferred to avoid. But even with these changes, the fundamental problem remains. The government's control over parliamentary time still limits how effective the Commons can be in holding ministers to account.
So, the rise of statutory instruments, bypassing the Commons. One of the most effective ways the government sidesteps parliamentary scrutiny is through the use of statutory instruments, or SIs. These are a type of delegated legislation that allows ministers to make or change laws without a full parliamentary vote. Originally, SIs were intended for technical adjustments, small changes that didn't need full debate. But over the years, the government has increasingly used them to push through controversial policies, often without proper oversight.
And the numbers are staggering. In the 1980s, around 6,600 pages of statutory instruments were passed each year. By the 2000s, that number had jumped to over 10,000 pages annually. What's worse is that statutory instruments are rarely rejected by Parliament. Out of the tens of thousands laid before the Commons since the 1950s, only 7 have ever been rejected. This means that the government can make significant changes to the law with minimal parliamentary scrutiny. It's another way that power is concentrated in the hands of ministers, leaving the Commons sidelined.
Yeah, well, I guess is why everybody wants a majority in Parliament.
Exactly.
Yeah. To summarize everything we just covered, while the Commons is supposed to be the place where government is held to account, it often feels more like a hollow shell, with the government's control over the time, the rise of the SIs, and the focus on theatrics over substance. Real scrutiny is really hard to come by.
If the Commons is struggling to keep the government in check, then where does the real scrutiny come from? And in the next chapter, we'll turn our attention to the law and uncover the truth behind how laws are really made and why the system is rigged for quick wins over careful scrutiny.
So, Chapter 9, the law. When we think of laws being made, we imagine rigorous debates, detailed scrutiny, and careful decision making. But what if I told you that the UK's legislative process is often more like a chaotic rush, with critical decisions pushed through without proper examination? Behind the scenes, the lawmaking process is far less thorough than it appears. Instead of careful scrutiny, the system is often fragmented and rushed, leaving laws open to flaws and unintended consequences. Today, we're breaking down exactly how this happens.
And the consequences are huge. Poorly scrutinized laws can lead to all sorts of problems. Gaps in legislation, contradictory rules, and policies that don't work in practice. So why is this happening? And how has the system reached this point? Well, let's get into it.
The Parliamentary Business and Legislation Committee, where it all begins. So every law starts with the Parliamentary Business and Legislation Committee, or the PBL for short. This little known but powerful group, made up of senior figures like the Leader of the Commons and the Chief Whip and the Attorney General, is responsible for shaping the government's legislative agenda. Departments submit bids to this committee asking for slots in the legislative timetable. But here's where things start to break down. Decisions are driven by political power dynamics, not necessarily by the need for certain laws.
Exactly. And ministers often push for laws that will boost their political standing, even if the legislation isn't ready or well thought out. The PBL committee acts as a gatekeeper, determining which bills will be pushed forward and which will be shelved. But instead of a system focused on good governance, it's often about political gain. And this rush to get laws through means that critical scrutiny is often the first thing sacrificed.
So, once the PBL gives the green light, the bill moves to the office of the Parliamentary Council, the legal drafters, who turn government ideas into actual laws. But the process is anything but smooth. Departments send long, detailed instructions explaining what they want the law to achieve. And here's where things get tricky. Those instructions aren't always clear, and there's enormous pressure to draft the bill quickly. Ministers want results fast, which means bills are often rushed through the drafting stage without the thorough review they need.
This rush can lead to poorly written laws, full of loopholes or contradictions. The drafters, known for their precision, work under intense pressure, and that's where mistakes slip through. Ministers eager to get their name on a piece of legislation push for speed over quality. And because the focus is on getting bills ready as quickly as possible, there's often little time to test whether the law will actually work in practice. It's a case of get it done now, fix it later. But that fix often never comes.
So, once the bill is drafted, it's introduced to Parliament, where it's supposed to go through several stages of scrutiny. But here's the reality. These stages are often more about formality than real examination. The first reading is just formality. The second reading, where MPs are supposed to debate the bill's principles, is often limited to 6 hours, hardly enough time to dive into the complex legislation.
And then there's the committee stage, where things should get serious. In theory, this is where the bill is scrutinised in detail, clause by clause. But here's the problem. Committee members are chosen by party whips, big surprise, and not even based on expertise. They are there to follow party lines, not to challenge the government's proposals. So what you end up with is a committee stage that rubber stamps legislation, with little meaningful debate or amendment. Opposition amendments are almost always rejected, and government bills sail through without it being properly examined.
Yeah, it's fucking crazy, isn't it?
Yep.
So next up, we've got the report stage, the last real chance for MPs to scrutinise the bill. But once again, here's the catch. It's often rushed too. Time is tightly controlled by what's known as a programme motion, which dictates how long MPs have to discuss the bill. And with multiple amendments to consider, the clock is always ticking. MPs barely have time to debate, and votes can eat up valuable minutes. The result? Critical amendments are often glossed over or skipped entirely.
This time pressure leads to a superficial discussion where the most important aspects of the bill might not even get the attention they deserve. It's a race to get everything done before time runs out, and that leaves little room for deep analysis. Backbench MPs who actually have expertise on the subject matter are often sidelined, and meaningful scrutiny is replaced by political point scoring.
Now, here's something that might surprise you. Despite the adversarial nature of British politics, the government and opposition often work together behind the scenes. It's called the usual channels, and it's where party business managers negotiate the timetable for debates. It's supposed to make Parliament run smoothly, but in reality, it means that backbench MPs and smaller parties have even less of a say in what happens. The government and opposition leadership strike deals that benefit them both, leaving little room for independent voices.
I was just thinking, when you see the two opposition leaders debating in the Commons, because they're they literally they work together all the time, right? Or to some extent, you can kind of understand why it's almost chummy, the debate. It's not actually almost serious. It's when someone's like, well, the right honourable gentleman, it's like me taking the piss out of you because we're mates. It's like they're almost doing the same. It's just kind of funny to think about that now in retrospect. Anyway, and because these deals are made informally away from public scrutiny, they shut out any real challenge to the legislative process. What you end up with is a system that prioritizes party leadership over true democratic debate. It's yet another reason why real scrutiny in the Commons is so hard to come by. Everything is pre-arranged, and MPs often don't get a meaningful say in what's debated or passed.
And then there's the rise of SIs, as mentioned before, which allow ministers to make a change to laws without full parliamentary vote. Originally intended for technical adjustments, SIs are now being used to push through more and more significant changes without proper oversight. The government has been increasingly relying on these shortcuts, which means less scrutiny and more unchecked power for the ministers.
And it's not a small issue. Tens of thousands of pages of statutory instruments are passed each year, often with little to no debate. MPs rarely reject them, so they sail through without the kind of scrutiny we expect from a democratic system. This unchecked use of SIs allows ministers to bypass Parliament entirely, leaving MPs with little power to challenge or amend key decisions.
Yes, so how to summarise this chapter? While the UK's legislative process might look rigorous from the outside, the reality is far different. Laws are often rushed, poorly scrutinised, and passed without the kind of detailed examination they need. The result is legislation that's full of flaws, loopholes, and unintended consequences.
Yeah. But if the Commons is struggling to hold the government to account, there's one place that's stepping up, the House of Lords, which I'm somewhat in two minds about on this chapter. In the next chapter, we'll explore how this ancient institution, despite its undemocratic roots, has become one of the few functioning parts of British governance.
Lovely. Let's get into the last chapter of the book then, chapter 10, The Lords. So the House of Lords, just the name alone, conjures up images of medieval traditions, aristocrats in robes, and a political institution stuck in the past. But here's the surprising truth. While the Lords may be undemocratic and rooted in centuries-old privilege, it has become one of the few effective checks on government power. The House of Lords stands apart as an unlikely defender of scrutiny and accountability, often stepping in where the House of Commons fails. So is it just a relic of the past or a vital player in modern British politics?
That's the question, Jess. For all its outdated elements, the Lords plays a crucial role in improving legislation and holding the government to account. It's a chamber where debate is more thoughtful, where expertise matters, and where laws are given the scrutiny they deserve. But how did we get here? How did an unelected body come to hold such power? Well, let's dive into it.
So, the House of Lords operates in what we might call a shadow world of legitimacy. It has real power, it can delay legislation, amend bills, and challenge government decisions. But here's the catch. It has to tread carefully because its very existence is always under scrutiny. Well, why? Because the Lords is unelected and largely unaccountable. Under the 1949 Parliament Act, the Lords can only delay bills for up to 13 months. If the Commons passes a bill in 2 successive sessions, it can become law without the Lords' approval. And then there's the Salisbury Convention, which prevents the Lords from blocking any legislation promised in a government's election manifesto.
So while the Lords has significant influence, it has to operate under these restrictions, knowing that if it oversteps, it risks being overhauled or even abolished. The Lords can suggest changes, improve bills, and ask tough questions, but it can't block government legislation outright. But within those limits, the Lords has become a surprisingly effective force for scrutiny and reform, pushing back on poorly drafted laws and calling out government overreach.
Now, the Lords wasn't always this independent or balanced. Historically, it was dominated by the hereditary peers, essentially the aristocracy, who often sided with the Conservative Party. But in 1999, Tony Blair's government introduced reforms that drastically reduced the number of hereditary peers. That reform created a more balanced chamber with life peers, those appointed for their expertise, taking on a larger role. This shift meant that no single party controls the Lords, and the chamber is now filled with specialists from various fields: academics, lawyers, former civil servants who bring real knowledge and experience to the table.
I wish that was the case, and I think it is to some extent, but I think the author, at least from what I've gathered from the book, I think he's quite a Tony Blair fan, and I'm pretty sure after, like, as Tony Blair was leaving office, he basically made a bunch of people lords, and most of them were basically like close mates. So a lot of the time, I feel like lords aren't really the experts that they're made out to be. They're people from the private sector who happen to be like, very close to the PM. So yeah, that's why I'm a bit like skeptical about why the Lords is such like a fundamental piece. And I think it's supposed to be, once again, but I don't think that all the Lords in it are, the people that they're made out to be.
Yeah.
But that's what makes the Lords so different from the Commons. While MPs are often selected for their political skills or campaigning abilities, peers in the Lords are chosen for their expertise. This has led to more thoughtful, informed debate and, crucially, less partisanship. Because the Lords isn't elected, its members aren't constantly worrying about winning the next election. And I think that's very true. I think that does make sense, because they're like, I think you get paid if you rock up for a debate. I can't remember how much it is. I feel like it's like £200 or something like that, maybe £400. You don't have to all the time, but it is nice to have that kind of third party objective person coming in and be like, well, I don't win or lose. I mean, I lose if this bill impacts me, but realistically, I'm just here for purely to debate it. But once again, not all of them are experts in their field. But yes, they can focus on long-term impact of laws rather than short-term political gains.
So, one of the most important differences between the Commons and the Lords is the culture of the debate. In the Commons, debates are often about assertion, pushing through party positions with as much force as possible. But in the Lords, it's all about justification. Tory peer Lord Norton once described it perfectly. He said that while the Commons operates on a culture of assertion, the Lords operates on a culture of justification. In other words, ministers can't just make bold claims, they have to back them up with reasoned arguments and evidence.
And that makes all the difference. In the Lords, ministers face a tougher time pushing through legislation without proper scrutiny. Peers ask challenging questions, demand explanations, and propose amendments based on careful consideration rather than political expediency. This process leads to laws that are often better thought out and more refined by the time they return to the Commons.
And one of the ways the Lords influence legislation is through a process known as ping pong, which is aptly named, I guess. When the Lords make amendments to the bill, it's sent back to the Commons for approval. The Commons can then accept, reject, or further amend the changes, and then the bill bounces back and forth between the two houses. This back and forth can happen multiple times, and while the Lords ultimately can't block a bill forever, its amendments often force the government to reconsider its position or offer compromises.
This ping-pong process can lead to real improvements in legislation. The Lords' amendments are often based on detailed scrutiny, and while the Commons has the final say, many of the Lords' suggestions are accepted because they improve the quality of the law. So while the Lords doesn't have the power to veto laws, it has a significant role in shaping them, ensuring that rushed or poorly drafted bills don't go through without careful consideration.
Here's something else that might surprise you. The Lords often stands alone as a check on government power. Because it controls its own timetable, the Lords can take its time scrutinising the bills, even when the Commons is rushing things through. And unlike the Commons, where the government has a majority, the Lord operates independently. No party has a majority in the Lords, which means that legislation gets a much more balanced review.
I like that. And that's right. In the Commons, the government can use its majority to push through bills without much resistance. But in the Lords, the government doesn't have that kind of control. It has to make its case and win over the peers, many of whom are experts in their fields and aren't swayed by party loyalty. This makes the Lords a vital counterbalance to the government, especially when the Commons is unable or unwilling to provide the necessary scrutiny.
But for all its strengths, the House of Lords operates under significant limitations. Its power is fragile, and it knows that pushing too far could lead to calls for its abolition or drastic reform. That's why the Lords rarely seeks to kill a bill outright. It focuses on revision, not obstruction. Peers understand that their role is to improve legislation and not block it. While they may delay bills or suggest amendments, they know that ultimately the Commons has the final word.
And that is the balancing act the Lords has to manage. It's a chamber that holds real power, but that power is always under threat. The Lords has to carefully navigate its role, providing necessary scrutiny without stepping on the toes of the elected Commons. Even so, the Lords has become one of the most effective parts of the British political system, providing that even an unelected body can play a crucial role in holding the government to account.
So, to summarise Chapter 10, while the House of Lords might seem like a relic from the bygone era, it's actually one of the few institutions providing real scrutiny in the UK political system. With its focus on expertise, balanced debate, and careful scrutiny, the Lords is playing a vital role in improving legislation and holding the government in check.
Right, so now we've seen across the last 10 chapters how the system is riddled with inefficiencies, short-term thinking, and unchecked power. But what if it didn't have to be this way? What if bad government isn't inevitable?
So, in our final section, we'll look at the solutions. What can be done to fix these flaws, and how can the UK political system evolve to serve the people better? Join us as we dive into the epilogue and explore how Westminster could work if we make the right changes. So, epilogue, solutions. Here's the thing, bad government isn't inevitable. Yes, the British political system has serious flaws, but these are not written in stone. These are the result of circumstances, inertia, and frankly, political self-interest. But the good news, these dysfunctions are reversible. There are examples all around the world of democratic systems that work more efficiently. Germany, the Nordic countries, and the Netherlands, to name a few. They've managed to overcome many of the issues that plague British politics by focusing on stability, long-term planning, and expertise.
Exactly. And this epilogue isn't just a post-mortem of a breakdown system. It's a roadmap for how things could be better. If the UK is willing to learn from these countries, it can reclaim the values of scrutiny, expertise, and cooperation that are the foundation of good governance. So, what can be done? What are the concrete steps that could transform British politics from dysfunctional to effective?
So, first up, let's talk about what's already working, select committees and the House of Lords. These two parts of the Westminster system reject the worst aspects of British politics. Hyper-partisanship, the rush for quick wins, and excessive government control. Instead, they focus on the essentials, scrutiny, expertise, and compromise. The select committees are made up of MPs from all parties, and they produce reports based on evidence, not political grandstanding. The House of Lords, with its culture of expertise, improves legislation through thoughtful revision.
And that's the key. These institutions show that when scrutiny is prioritized, good governance follows. Expanding the role of select committees and empowering the Lords even further could create a more balanced system, where laws are thoroughly examined before they become reality. Scrutiny ensures that bad ideas are weeded out. Expertise guarantees that the good ones are refined, and compromise ensures that policies have staying power because they represent a wider range of perspectives.
A second solution is a proportional representation, so a fairer voting system. One of the most transformative changes the UK could make is adopting the proportional representation (PR). The current first past the post system distorts representation in favour of larger parties and leaves millions of votes effectively wasted. PR would ensure that every vote counts and that Parliament more accurately reflects the will of the people. By encouraging coalition governments, PR fosters cooperation between parties. This would reduce the toxic tribalism that's so common in British politics today and promote long-term solutions that address chronic national issues like social care, inequality, and climate change.
That's right. And PR would also lead to a more centrist cooperative approach to governance. It would encourage parties to work together rather than focus on defeating one another. This shift could be key to breaking the cycle of short term thinking and creating policies that actually solve problems rather than just win headlines. Under PR, the voting system would be fairer, with larger constituencies represented by multiple MPs. It's a change that could fundamentally alter the way politics is conducted in the UK for the better. Although the only thing with that is that sometimes when you have hung parliaments, that nothing really gets done because there's two parties that are both in the majority. So they kind of almost argue against each other and nothing really gets done.
But also valid. Yeah, I don't think there's any system about its own consequences, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So the third idea is reducing the workload of MPs. So the other issue, MPs are overwhelmed. Constituency casework takes up a massive amount of their time that should be spent scrutinising legislation and making laws at work. So one solution is to create a separate body to handle this casework, freeing MPs to focus on their legislative responsibilities. This would allow them to dive deeper into bills, actually understand the issues at stake, and make informed decisions on behalf of their constituents.
Exactly. And along with that, MPs should have better access to independent research and information. Giving backbenchers the tools they need to challenge the government could help level the playing field and ensure that MPs aren't just rubber stamping whatever the government puts in front of them.
Next, we can move on to the role of ministers. Too often, ministers are shuffled between departments before they've actually had a chance to really understand their brief. They're promoted for political reasons, not based on expertise in the areas they oversee. What is the solution to this? Hold ministers accountable for their decisions, even after they leave office. Giving select committees the power to recall ministers for up to 6 years after they've stepped down could ensure that they think about the long-term consequences of their policies.
And special advisors, or SPADs, should be hired through a transparent process based on merit, not just political connections. This would improve the quality of advice ministers receive and ensure that decisions are based on solid expertise rather than political manoeuvring. Prime ministers should also be encouraged to appoint ministers with relevant expertise, even if that means bringing people from outside Parliament. In doing so, they could bring in the right knowledge to address complex issues, whether in health, education, or defence.
Another key area for reform, the civil service. For too long, the UK civil service has valued generalism, where officials jump from one department to another over deep expertise. But the challenges facing modern government require specialists who understand their fields inside and out. Encouraging civil servants to specialise and develop long-term knowledge in areas like health, education, or defence would lead to better policy outcomes and more informed decision-making.
And to make this work, the civil service needs a strong managerial layer that prioritises talent retention and development. Human resources departments should focus on long-term planning, ensuring that the civil service maintains the expertise it needs to function effectively.
And finally, the media. The media plays a crucial role in holding the government to account, but local journalism is in crisis. With local newspapers disappearing, communities are losing their watchdogs, the reporters who connect national policies with their local impacts. A public fund for local journalism could help revive this vital institution, ensuring that local reporters have the resources they need to investigate, report, and hold local governments accountable.
And beyond that, the media industry needs to shift away from short-term metrics like clicks and focus more on long-term engagement. Investigative journalism, which is often expensive and time-consuming, needs to be prioritized again. Without a robust press, democracy suffers.
So, conclusion. So, what is the takeaway after all this? Bad government isn't inevitable. The dysfunctions of the British political system can be fixed, but it requires a commitment to scrutiny, expertise, and long term thinking.
By embracing these values, scrutiny, expertise, and compromise, the UK can reclaim the principles of good governance. It's not just about fixing Westminster, it's about building a government that works for the people, not just for political parties. Change is possible. The question is, are we ready to make it happen? And there we go.
That's it.
Yeah, no, I thought it was a good book, to be fair. I very much enjoyed it, and I think because of, if you have little knowledge on how the system actually works, then it's pretty crazy when you hear some of the stories about how it actually operates. I think he's pretty optimistic to assume that the system can be made better, because I think it can be made better, but just to what extent? And I think I would love to read an alternative perspective from someone who's in it and who's
very, very negative, wasn't he? That's my
it was
book.
Yeah, it was all one-sided, and I think although I'm not doubting that this stuff is legit, I want to know why it's become like that, because I can imagine that there is a huge time pressure on things to be pushed through. And once again, like we were discussing earlier, with a democracy, you have to take into consideration more people's opinions. Things need to be scrutinized more. And how much does that get in the way of actually being productive or effective?
Yeah.
So the issue with that is, I feel like over time, as the political system has evolved, it seems like almost the prime minister has gotten rid of certain laws to push things through, and they're able to do that because they have the most power. But it's almost like Chesterton's law. It's like they don't actually know why they're removing the fence. They're just doing it for that specific context of, I need to push this bill through by tomorrow. Okay, so they change a whole rule about something to do with the House of Commons or whatever, but actually that ends up having a huge impact on everything else. And once again, it's like interfering with this ecological system, and you don't know what you're actually doing. And I think there needs to be, if they're going to change the fundamental system of how politics is run, how parliament or the government is run, there has to be almost a third party to come and be like, if you do this, this is the impact it has on all these other areas. You can't just willy-nilly come in and be like, I need to change this because this specific topic needs to, this specific issue is at large. And so that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with what you're saying. I think you're spot on with that. I guess another thing I was thinking of in terms of all the solutions, I think one of the easiest and most necessary ones, I think personally, would be just holding people to account. Like the people who make these decisions, you can't just fucking get promoted for making a bad decision.
No,
that will force people to actually really think through stuff before they do it. Which I guess once again you're trading off that efficiency for more time spent scrutinizing an issue. But I mean, there's the saying, isn't it? It's like you should spend 99% of your time when you're problem solving on the problem or defining the problem itself, rather than just going out and just changing everything. So I think that'd be a welcome change for people to be punished, for fucking up, especially with lots of people's lives.
Absolutely. There's no accountability. I mean, just look at what COVID did and all these stupid fucking rules that were put in place that have had this huge detrimental effect on people and their lives, and yet, most of them have just been promoted to other fucking departments. They're ministers of other departments and weren't held accountable for anything. I mean, ridiculous. But
yeah. Right. So that wraps up our deep dive into Ian Dunt's How Westminster Work and Why It Doesn't. We've explored the hidden flaws of the British political system, and more importantly, we've looked at how things could change for the better. If you found this breakdown insightful, we'd love to have you stick around with us.
If you're interested in more deep dives like this, whether it's politics, personal development, or anything in between, make sure to hit that subscribe button.
And don't forget to give us a like if today's video resonated with you. It really helps the channel grow and ensures we can keep bringing you these in-depth, thoughtful summaries.
Also, if you know someone who's passionate about politics or could benefit from understanding how the system really works, share this video with them. The more people we reach, the more these important ideas can spread.
So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time with another Wise Words Book Summary.